So, you want to play Revenge of the Runelords. Hello and welcome back to Podfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's video is the final entry in my Merry Little SinMas series, and if you don't know what that means, I suggest checking out the playlist in the description. Basically, over the past 6 weeks, I've covered the story of the Runelords of Thassilon in the Age of Lost Omens, with the explicit intention of preparing players and GMs for Return of the Runelords. Today's video is the culmination of that effort, a video player's guide focusing on the epic conclusion of the Runelords saga, Revenge of the Runelords, the final AP published in Paizo's monthly paperback product line. For those unfamiliar with my player's guides, this video will provide a brief overview of the structure and themes of the campaign, while remaining light on spoilers. I'll provide a rundown of the setting and the lore leading up to the campaign, then dig into some mechanical options players can select to have a thematic connection to the story, including ancestries, classes, and religious options. The end of the video will be me laying out the changes I would suggest GMs make to this AP. If you've seen my previous SinMas content, you would correctly surmise that I am a big-time Thassilon nerd. For that reason, I have a lot of changes I would make to this AP. Don't take that to mean that this AP isn't good or that I don't like it. It has a lot of strengths, in addition to its fair share of weaknesses. So, if it sounds fun to you after this video, don't let the number of changes I would suggest dissuade you from trying it out. Before I go any further, I should also lay out my sources for this video. If you're planning to run or play Revenge of the Runelords, you'll need access to all 3 books in the adventure path, as well as the official player's guide, which is available for free online. Link in the description. Given that this is the high-level mythic campaign for PF2E, I could definitely see Paizo eventually printing a hardcover collection of this AP, so keep your eyes open for that in the future. Beyond these primary sources, you might also want access to a few rulebooks to supplement your understanding of the mechanics. In specific, War of Immortals is the most important, since it details the rules for the mythic system, which is core to the experience of this AP. You might also want the Lost Omens Rivals Academy lore book, which details the remastered version of the Runelord class archetype for the wizard. If you're operating off of the Secrets of Magic version of the archetype, you might run into some mechanical issues in the post-remaster era. Of course, all these rules are available for free online, so check out Archives of Nethys. Shifting focus from mechanics to lore, the GM might want to review the previous APs in the Runelords saga, Rise of the Runelords, Shattered Star, and Return of the Runelords. Alternatively, you and your group could just watch all of my SinMas content, since the story of the Runelords is long and winding, and spread across about 60 distinct publications. Plus, I could use the views. Either way, at least the GM should review the history of the Runelords in some way, shape, or form, since this AP works best with the added context of what came before in the Runelords saga. More on that in a bit. Before that, though, if you enjoyed this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing, or commenting below. Or, if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon. Just $2 a month gets you access to all of my scripts, as well as the audio files for all of my scripted videos, all of which drop at least a week early. With that out of the way, let's start with the campaign overview. Like I mentioned in my introduction, Revenge of the Runelords is the high-level mythic adventure path for PF2E, representing the highest level of power players can achieve in an official Paizo publication so far. For that reason, I expect it will be fairly popular, similar to how Wrath of the Righteous was popular back in 1E. Following Paizo's recent business model, Revenge is a 3-part adventure path, consisting of books 219, 220, and 221 in the AP product line. Notably, this is the final AP published in the monthly paperback format, ending a publication streak which started back in 2007 with Burnt Offerings, Book 1 of Rise of the Runelords. Mechanically, Revenge starts players off at level 12, and takes them all the way to level 20. The campaign also makes use of the Mythic rule set, granting Mythic progression to PCs, and taking them to the end of their Mythic Destiny path. For those unfamiliar, Mythic in PF2E is essentially a souped-up version of Free Archetype, which grants characters access to Mythic points in place of hero points. These points can be spent to perform impressive actions, and Mythic feats give you new ways to spend them. This video is not a primer on the Mythic system, since I'm not really a rules guy. There are plenty of videos out there explaining Mythic better than I ever could, and it's pretty straightforward as a system, so it should be fairly easy to figure out. Within the world, the story of Revenge of the Runelords focuses on the Saga lands of northwestern Avestan. Specifically, the campaign is spread over the nations of New Thassilon and Varissia, with the narrative also involving the lands of the Lenorm kings in a small way. This is a travel-heavy AP, and players should expect to move to a wide variety of locales with a degree of frequency throughout the story. There are also a few field trips off of the material plane, which shouldn't be surprising given the high-level nature of the narrative. While travel is a major aspect of the story, the city of Xin-Eurythnia, formerly called Xin-Shalast, has a degree of particular importance. This is where the story begins, and players should expect to return here at least once. This isn't a hub city, however, so players should avoid building characters intended to function in a mostly urban campaign. Narratively, Revenge really works to take the Mythic system and compose a mythical story with it. The authors of this AP were clearly thinking big when they composed this narrative. I'll use the phrase gods and monsters throughout this video, and that's the best way I can think of to succinctly describe the vibe. This is a story of mortal beings ascending to the level of power necessary to confront villains on the level of gods, and monsters who threaten entire cities. The challenges the players will face in this AP feel like they come from the pages of the Odyssey, the Silmarillion, or in one case, the Bible itself. Like I said, gods and monsters. So, now, do the mechanics back up this narrative intensity? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We'll get to that. Getting a bit more specific, many of the enemies in this campaign fall into the category of ancient evils. The fundamental threat at the core of the entire Runelords saga is the resurgence of ancient evil, corruption and danger from the distant past which has been given new life in a world unprepared for its power. These ancient evils are often the agents of the Runelords, the wizard kings who ruled as tyrants over the empire of Thassilon 10,000 years ago. From sin-spawn to rune giants to constructs, cultists, and conjured demons. All these enemy types draw their motivations or origins from the Runelords, and the wickedness they fostered within their kingdoms. In Revenge of the Runelords, the resurgent evils of the past are back once again to threaten Varissia and Golarion as a whole. The time has finally come to put down this historic threat once and for all. Lastly, one foundational piece of this narrative is, for better or worse, nostalgia. The writers of this AP were clearly asked to include callbacks to previous APs in the Runelords saga, and they did so with gusto. In a lot of ways, this makes sense. Revenge of the Runelords can be best thought of as the culmination of 18 years of storytelling from Paizo. It's a celebration of the history of the Runelords and the Pathfinder system, and to accomplish this, it makes a lot of sense for the narrative to embrace the popular story elements of past chapters in the Runelords saga. Unfortunately, this has the unwanted side effect of giving Revenge of the Runelords an astonishingly deep learning curve for players and GMs new to the story. Challenges and encounters, which are a callback for players who've played through previous APs, will lack context for new players, and the amount of narrative ground this AP covers leaves very little room for the author to add that context back in. In some places, the missing context doesn't matter too much. In some places, this missing context doesn't matter too much, and new players and GMs will find the narrative entirely self-justified within the text itself. In a lot of cases, however, these callbacks and the assumed foreknowledge upon which they rely become load-bearing. Players unfamiliar with the previous stories will feel lost at multiple points, and I know this because I've been reviewing this AP with players exactly like that in preparation for this video. I doubt the level of importance of the previous Runelord APs was intentional on the part of the authors or editors, but unfortunately, they failed on several points to make this narrative entirely self-sufficient. And just to be clear, I don't blame the writers for this. They were given a Herculean task. They have, collectively, about 200 pages to tell a story which is simultaneously a self-contained storyline, a climax to a 4-part meta-narrative which was developed piecemeal over 20 years, and the first foray into high-level mythic in PF2E. This would be hard to pull off in 6 books, let alone 3. The end result suffers from a lot of assumed foreknowledge on the part of players and GMs in order to get the maximum enjoyment out of the campaign. So let's get a bit more specific. What exactly are we doing in Revenge of the Runelords? The structure of Revenge of the Runelords follows the classic Runelords AP story structure, albeit scaled up to accommodate the higher-level mythic nature of the story being told. This AP is essentially a tour across the lands of ancient Thassilon, including New Thassilon and Varissia. Travel from one place to another plays an important role in the story, though with 2 notable early exceptions, the act of travel itself isn't really detailed, or intended to be seen as a challenge to overcome. I give the authors, and especially Michelle Kim, the author of Book 1, a lot of credit. They came up with a fun means of travel which feels sufficiently epic and appropriate for a mythic story. The motivation for this travel is the need for the PCs to respond to and resolve a multi-layered conspiracy which threatens the world of Golarion, very much in line with the plots of Rise and Return. To resolve the mystery of this vast conspiracy, the heroes will be digging through the history of ancient Thassilon. This exploration of history is performed in 3 significant ways. First, the heroes will research historic documents and records. I'll get into this in more detail soon, but the research subsystem plays a significant role in the story. Thassilonian rituals and magic play a key role in the narrative, and discovering the nature of these things requires careful examination of books in ancient libraries. Second, the heroes will explore ancient dungeons. Most of the spaces the heroes will explore in this AP are sites built during the ancient Thassilonian period. By interacting with these sites, the heroes will gain the clues needed to solve the mysteries they face. Third, the heroes will actively oppose ancient evils. I mentioned this already, but most of the enemies in this AP are tied to ancient Thassilon and the Runelords in some way. Ancient villains are stirring again, and it's up to the heroes to face and defeat them. As the heroes progress in their journey, it will become clear that the threats they face are far greater than just a king seeking power or a warlord seeking to ignite conflict. Revenge of the Runelords deals with the idea of the apocalypse, from local apocalypses to the total annihilation of Golarion. I don't really consider this a spoiler, since this is a 20th level mythic AP, and the last time we did that was Wrath of the Righteous, which pitted the heroes against a demonic invasion which threatened all of Avestan. This time, we're getting even bigger, so wrap your head around that right off the bat. Lastly, if your group has previously played one or more of the APs in the Runelords saga, then a major aspect of this narrative will be reliving your past experiences in and around Varissia. This AP will put players in close contact with locations, story elements, and even enemies and NPCs from previous adventures. If you've played the previous APs, you will constantly be saying, "Hey, I know you." Seriously, it's going to be a constant string of the Leo staring at the TV meme. This can be good, but I caution GMs and players not to let it become so prominent that it becomes detrimental to the enjoyment of the plot itself. This constant nostalgia drip runs the risk of becoming like the South Park member berries, holding a group back from immersing themselves in the AP's story fully. In short, make sure that this feels like the 80s nostalgia of Stranger Things Season 1, rather than the 80s nostalgia of Seasons 2 and 3. One fun thing to note is that this AP presents plenty of opportunities for players to interact with their own PCs from previous adventure paths. If that's the kind of thing you like, then this is definitely the AP for you. Expanding upon that, the ideal gaming group for this AP is a group of players who've played through Rise of the Runelords, Shattered Star, The Year of the Risen Rune, and Return of the Runelords, and even Curse of the Crimson Throne for good measure. The more of these your group has played, the more fun you will have with Revenge of the Runelords. The most important of these is definitely Return, so if you've played at least that one, you've covered the most relevant information. Now let's move over to the mechanics by which Revenge of the Runelords communicates its story to the players. Following the recent trends in Paizo Adventure Path design, Revenge implements a variety of challenge types for players to overcome, from basic combat to social influence encounters. The campaign makes notable use of a series of short to medium dungeon crawls, involving multiple encounter types in close succession. These dungeons mix combat encounters with hazards and traps, then even throw in a few influence encounters for additional variety. While this might seem jarring for players accustomed to more conventional combat-heavy dungeon crawling, I found the implementation surprisingly refreshing and well executed, at least in 4 of the 5 notable dungeon crawls. The 5th case is a bit different, but I'll get into that in the section on GM advice. But, of course, Revenge of the Runelords isn't limited to dungeon crawls, and in truth, they only make up about 30 to 40% of the overall text of the campaign. The rest is broken up into small, single-combat mission-style encounters, and larger, more narratively complex challenges represented by some variation on the victory point systems. And this is the point where your enjoyment of this AP will either live or die based on your enjoyment of these subsystems. Revenge of the Runelords is extremely dependent on the many victory point subsystems Paizo has developed. Some of these systems can easily be hand-waved away and converted into basic combats or roleplay encounters, but others are entirely load-bearing and would be functionally impossible to remove and replace without serious structural work for the GM. The implementation of these subsystems is really a mixed bag. Some of them are absolutely fantastic. Again, I have to applaud Michelle Kim for implementing the single best chase sequence I've ever seen in an AP. If the GM does their prep work, the chase which opens the AP is the strongest start I've ever seen in a Paizo campaign. Book 2, meanwhile, has an absolutely fantastic play on the influence rules built into a dungeon. Unfortunately, for all the great or good implementations of these systems, there are an equal number which are either bad or, unfortunately, outright terrible. 2 chase sequences in particular, one in Book 1 and one in Book 2, are completely foundational to their sections of the narrative, and their implementation is so poor that these sections fall completely flat, despite some absolutely incredible narrative setup. This is where the mechanics sometimes fail to live up to the epic nature of the story, and unless your GM is willing to put in the work to fix these issues, the offending sections of the story are going to feel cheap and unimpactful. I get into my proposed fixes later in the spoiler section of this video, but fair warning, it's pretty involved. Beyond chases, the research subsystem functions as a sort of recurring mechanical theme, connecting books 2 and 3 in particular. The PCs will return to the research subsystem at 3 major points in the AP, and these sequences, especially the third one, can be surprisingly involved. At a high level, the chase system appears at 3 key sequences, one of which is good and 2 of which are bad. The influence subsystem appears frequently across all 3 books, and while none of them are especially bad, a few minor modifications can make the weaker ones substantially better. Other subsystems crop up throughout all 3 books, and most of them are either fine or good, though individually they play a much smaller role in the narrative overall. Getting even more granular, the enemy types in this AP are pleasantly diverse, ranging from dragons and trolls to cultists and krakens. There is, however, one major caveat to this variety. PCs in this campaign are going to fight an insane number of wizards. Seriously, there are so many wizards to fight in this AP. I could definitely see that becoming old for some players, especially for those not versed in Thassilonian history. Personally, I loved it, but that's because I've written almost 200,000 words on ancient Thassilon. Outside of this particular recurring enemy type, however, the enemy variety in this AP is generally quite good. The only potential issue I want to highlight is that the combat frequency in Book 1 in particular is very low. If your group is built around combat, you will want your GM to add a few extra encounters in Book 1 to give your characters time to flex their muscles. Personally, I think Book 1 needs just a bit more combat, since the PF2E system is a combat system first and foremost. But hey, your group might like the balance just fine as is. As you might have guessed from my discussion of challenge types and combat frequency, Revenge of the Runelords uses a lot of skill checks to challenge players outside of direct combat. Of all the skills in the game, Arcana is the single most important skill for players in Revenge of the Runelords. The table on the right illustrates the number of skill checks which occur in each book, discounting combat use cases, which I cannot reasonably count. As you can see, Arcana is used fully twice as much as the next most used skill in the campaign. For this reason, I would suggest that any character with at least a positive intelligence score should put at least some skill increases into Arcana, and the party should absolutely have one high intelligence character who specializes in the Arcana skill. The other core recall knowledge skills, nature, occultism, religion, and society, are all about evenly used, so the party should diversify to cover those if possible. Of the traditional exploration skills, athletics and thievery are the most frequently used, while stealth and acrobatics are used much less often. Of the three social skills, diplomacy and intimidation are definitely the most impactful, while deception is the least useful overall. Crafting is notable for being useful in a surprising number of instances, but I need to clarify that this is not a downtime-heavy campaign. Outside of the research subsystem sequences, the narrative generally moves at a breakneck pace, so if you put points into crafting, you shouldn't expect to have time to craft a ton of magic items. Please note, this analysis does not take into account the skills used to identify monsters, since I don't count those. It also does not account for the general usefulness of skills in combat. Intimidation, for instance, is important for the demoralize action, which is key to the success of many parties. Medicine is necessary for keeping the party alive, even if the AP doesn't use it to advance the plot. If you play a rogue or a swashbuckler, the acrobatics skill is critically important for your character. All that to say, there are limits into the insight this type of analysis can provide. Looking at the lore skills used in this AP, the four most frequent are art, academia, library, and warfare lore, though these are not evenly distributed throughout the campaign by any means. A number of other lore skills are used much less frequently throughout the AP, from architecture lore, which comes up a handful of times, to labor lore, which comes up exactly once. But the four I listed are the ones worth covering, if you have the skill increases to spare. One lore skill, which I was expecting to see, but which I did not, is Thassilon lore. In campaigns like Season of Ghosts, we've seen local lore categories, like Willowshore lore, so I anticipated Thassilon lore making a debut in this campaign. If I were to GM this, and I had a player who wanted to put points into Thassilon lore, I would absolutely allow it. This lore skill would allow for the identification of sites, artifacts, and creatures whose origins lie in ancient Thassilon, with the same or lower DC than the standard check for those subjects. Undead developed specifically in Gastache, for instance, could be studied with both religion and Thassilon lore. As another example, rituals based on Thassilonian magical theory, like the Rune-Waking ritual or the Viridian Transcendence, could be worked out with Arcana, Occultism, or Thassilon lore, and would maybe have a lower DC if the character is trained or better in all three. If you like this idea, talk to your GM. The study of Thassilonian history is a significant part of this campaign, and previous Runelords campaigns as well, so I think it's a no-brainer. That said, your GM could very reasonably determine that this proposed lore skill is too powerful, or too broad, and would need to be narrowed. So, with all that high-level understanding out of the way, where do we actually begin in Revenge of the Runelords? The setup for Revenge is fairly straightforward and simple. Sorcian, Queen of Eurythnia and former Runelord of Lust, is preparing to open her capital city to the world. She's near the completion of the Circle of Open Hands, an immense portal which will connect directly to Absalom, making Sorcian's city into a regional trading hub. In celebration, Sorcian has officially renamed the city from Xin-Shalast, its name under Karzug, to Xin-Eurythnia, the name of her traditional seat of power. She has declared a grand opening ceremony to commemorate the event. Very much in line with her past behavior, Sorcian has invited famous and accomplished adventurers from all over the world to witness. Each of the heroes who've agreed to attend have been presented with newly crafted Sihedron amulets, the first to have been newly produced since before Earthfall. The PCs of this adventure are some of these heroes. The player characters in Revenge of the Runelords begin the campaign as accomplished heroes, likely at the local or even regional level. Sorcian has a habit of collecting heroes, and some PCs might be motivated to specifically catch her eye and pick up some gameful employment. The heroes have recently arrived in Xin-Eurythnia and been presented with their Sihedron amulets. Their room and board has been covered per Sorcian's invitation, and the heroes have a few days to familiarize themselves with the city before the Circle of Open Hands ceremony kicks off. And now we come to the million-dollar question. What should you and your group play prior to Revenge of the Runelords? If you want to play a campaign before Revenge, with the explicit intention of leading directly into Revenge, you basically have 3 good options at time of writing: 7 Dooms for Sandpoint, Mythspeaker, and Shades of Blood. Of these 3 choices, 7 Dooms is certainly the best. 7 Dooms was written by James Jacobs, the creator of Sandpoint and the Runelords, and was in many ways written as an intentional prequel to Revenge. 7 Dooms ends at level 12, leaving characters perfectly set up for Revenge. Additionally, the plot of 7 Dooms foreshadows an incredibly important character in Revenge, who can't be foreshadowed in any other Pathfinder adventure. Also, 7 Dooms is the final chapter in the Sandpoint story, which started back in Book 1 of Rise of the Runelords. At the same time, Revenge of the Runelords is the final chapter of the Runelords saga, which also started in Book 1 of Rise. The only issue I have is that the themes of 7 Dooms and Revenge are a bit counter-aligned. 7 Dooms is ultimately a story of small-town heroes saving their community. Revenge is a world-saving story, which involves powers on the scale of the gods. Normally, this contradiction wouldn't be a huge problem, since APs like Rise of the Runelords start with a small-town adventure and escalate to the level of the Runelords pretty regularly. The problem comes from the fact that there isn't really time to breathe between the end of 7 Dooms and the beginning of Revenge. If you run them back to back with no break in universe, the tonal whiplash might feel a little weird. Also, the characters who will excel in 7 Dooms are not the same characters who will excel in Revenge, so that could potentially be an issue. The second best option is Mythspeaker, the other mythic AP in the Pathfinder system. Mythspeaker takes characters from level 1 to level 10, and introduces the mythic rules right at the beginning. This campaign has the advantage of having players already familiar with the mythic rules, which could be a huge boon for players who aren't as mechanically minded. That's basically where the advantages end, however, since Mythspeaker takes place in a completely unrelated location, fighting completely unrelated enemies, and involving PCs who likely have backstories and motivations completely unrelated to the plot of Revenge. Sorshan would certainly be interested in the heroes of Mythspeaker, and would definitely invite them to Xin-Eurythnia. Beyond that, however, there isn't much of an intrinsic reason for the heroes of Mythspeaker to become invested in the fate of Sorshan or her kingdom. The third, and least compelling option to consider is Shades of Blood. Shades of Blood leaves players at level 10, but doesn't introduce the mythic rules, leaving players to level up their characters and figure out the mythic content at the beginning of Revenge. The one small advantage which Shades of Blood has is that it very vaguely foreshadows a single minor NPC in Revenge. As far as I'm concerned, it isn't worth running Shades as an explicit prequel to Revenge. That said, if you are running Shades, and your players want to carry over their characters into a new campaign, Revenge could maybe be a good option. In an ideal world, my suggestion would be to run 7 Dooms from beginning to end with a group of PCs. Then, once that is done, play an adventure, probably Pray for Death, as a palate cleanser. After that, start Revenge of the Runelords with all new characters, intended to interact with the gods and monsters' nature of the story. This has the best of both worlds. Your players get the foreshadowing of the major NPC from 7 Dooms, but they don't need to work to make characters intended for a smaller story fit into a more epic narrative. Plus, running Pray for Death in between gives the players a front row seat for an important background event which impacts the world before Revenge begins. All of this together, 7 Dooms into Pray for Death into Revenge, would be about the length of a traditional 6-book AP. So it shouldn't be too overwhelming if your group is already accustomed to those longer campaigns. History and Lore. So this history and lore section will not be as extensive as my usual fare for this type of video. To fully absorb the history of ancient Thassilon and the story of the Runelords, I suggest you watch through my entire 12 Days of SinMas and Merry Little SinMas series. And to be entirely clear, Revenge of the Runelords definitely requires homework in order to make sense. This AP was written with a specific audience in mind. An audience deeply familiar with Thassilonian history and lore, either by having played the previous Runelords APs or by having read them in detail. Like I said earlier, the more of the previous APs you have played or read, the more fun you'll have with this AP. I discussed this in detail with some colleagues on Bramblebear's channel. During these discussions, RPG editor Nick Turak deliberately kept himself in the dark about the previous APs in the Runelords saga, to see how newcomer-friendly this AP actually is. And, unfortunately, in many cases, he was completely lost. Going into this AP blind will likely leave a player lost in terms of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and who they are fighting. Some homework is absolutely necessary in order to enjoy this AP as the writers intended. So, how much homework should you actually do? In a perfect world, Revenge of the Runelords should be played by a group after it has played through Rise of the Runelords, Curse of the Crimson Throne, The Year of the Risen Rune, Shattered Star, and Return of the Runelords. That said, this probably describes less than 2% of all Pathfinder groups on Earth, and having to run all of these is not realistic for new groups. That's a big part of why I made the SinMas videos in the first place. Watching my videos is a more efficient way to get all the necessary lore and context, so long as all you care about is the high-level summaries. Now let's talk about a homework strategy. If you and your group are considering playing Revenge of the Runelords, I suggest that you all agree on a shared plan. If the GM watches the entire SinMas series, but the players only watch the Merry Little SinMas videos from 2025, that's totally fine and would likely work well. If everyone watches all of the content, that's probably fine too. Heck, even if everyone agrees to go in completely blind and just enjoy the fights and challenges without context, that could probably still work in its own way. But if the GM hasn't watched any of the videos or read any of the previous campaigns, and one or more of the players has, that could present a serious problem. So just come to a consensus as a group and make a plan. So long as all the players have a similar level of understanding of the lore, and none of them have a greater understanding than the GM, you can make this work pretty easily. So what about the history and lore section of this video? Well, the best way to get all the history and lore is to just watch my SinMas content, but if you've already seen all that and just want a quick TLDR summary of the highlights, or if you simply can't be bothered and just want enough lore to get started in the campaign right away, here we go. More than 11,000 years ago, in the Aslanti Empire, the archwizard Xin combined the teachings of the rune goddess Lissala with his observation on the magic of the native peoples of northern Avestan. From there, he synthesized a new lens through which to view the study of magic. Rune magic, the study of the naturally occurring runes which appear when magic is cast. Xin's discovery threatened the power structure of Aslant, and he was soon exiled to Avestan, where he and his followers founded a new empire, Thassilon. Here, Xin and his apprentices further refined their study of rune magic, which divided all spells into 8 primary categories, 7 major and 1 minor. Xin associated each of these primary subdivisions, called schools, with a virtue, a color, and a sky metal, and appointed 7 apprentices who would each specialize in one of those schools. Xin himself attempted to master all 7 schools, an accomplishment he marked with the creation of the Sihedron artifact, not to be confused with the Sihedron rune, a 7-pointed star symbol associated with the faith of Lissala and the broader study of rune magic as a whole. Xin, though an accomplished wizard, proved to be an inattentive king, and he eventually ceded much of his political power to his 7 apprentices, whom he named Runelords. The 7 Runelords then took over management of their local kingdoms within the empire, and were free to diverge from Xin's idealism. And diverge they did, as they discovered and exploited a fundamental flaw in rune magic's design. The casting of spells of a particular school, which all shared a fundamental rune, induced emotional responses in the caster, eventually becoming addictive. These same emotional responses could be triggered by indulging in specific sinful activities. Each school was then associated not with one of Xin's 7 virtues, but with one of the 7 deadly sins. From here, the Runelords fell to corruption, and within a few years they arranged for the assassination of Xin. After Xin's death, the Runelords were free to rule their kingdoms and indulge in their sinful ways without opposition. Of course, peaceful cooperation between the Runelords was always a pipe dream. It didn't take long for the 7 member states of Thassilon to go to war, and intermittent fighting would flare up between them for 1,000 years thereafter. The 7 schools, and their associated sins, colors, sky metals, kingdoms, and rune lords are as follows. The School of Transmutation is focused on physical transformations. It is associated with the sin of greed, in the sense that many transmuters transform something of little value into something of high value. Transmutation is also associated with the color yellow, and the sky metal adamantine. The Runelords of Greed ruled over Shalast, an enormous kingdom in central Thassilon which was rich in mineral wealth. The capital city was Xin-Shalast, hidden in the Koror Mountains and masked with eldritch magic. In total, there were 8 Runelords of Greed by the time of Thassilon's collapse: Caladerne, Fethrir, Gimel, Lignia, Masmirana, Aethusa, Haframa, and Karzug. Karzug was the mightiest of the Runelords of Greed, and ruled for nearly 500 years. Beyond the study of transmutation, the Runelords of Greed also focused on alchemy and the study of the nightmare realm of Leng. The School of Evocation is focused on the rapid release of energy. It is associated with the sin of wrath, and practitioners of wrath were known for their furious tempers and the explosive ways they expressed their anger with magic. Evocation is also associated with the color orange, and the sky metal Sikatite. The Runelords of Wrath ruled over Bakrakhan, a mountainous and heavily forested region in the west, populated with warring tribes. The capital city was Xin-Bakrakhan, sometimes called Hollow Mountain, a fortress tunneled into the roots of a towering mountain. In total, there were 5 Runelords of Wrath: Alderpash, Angothane, Zirin, Thibidos, and Alasnist. Of these, Alasnist was absolutely the strongest, and ruled for nearly 500 years. Beyond evocation, the Runelords of Wrath also focused on demonology and, to a lesser extent, flesh warping. The School of Necromancy is focused on the manipulation of positive and negative energy, now called Vitality and Void. It is associated with the sin of gluttony, as the consumption of vitality and void is satiating in the same way as overindulgence in rich food. Necromancy is also associated with the color indigo, and the sky metal Inubrix. The Runelords of Gluttony ruled over Gastash, a kingdom in the east with fertile farmland. The capital city was Xin-Gastash, a subterranean city built beneath a mountain called the Sleeper. In total, there were 5 Runelords of Gluttony: Califesta, Atherend, Aethusa, yes, another one, Goparlus, and Zutha. Zutha may or may not have been the mightiest, but he was the first to embrace undeath by becoming a lich. The Runelords of Gluttony shared no common interest outside of their focus on necromancy and rich eating, at least none that has been published. The School of Conjuration focused on 2 things: the transfer of mass from one place to another, and the creation of summoned allies. In short, teleportation, creation, and summoning. The school is associated with the sin of sloth, since practitioners developed a tendency to summon servants to do their work. Conjuration is also associated with the color blue and the sky metal Abyssium. The Runelords of Sloth ruled over Haruka, the smallest of the Thassilonian member states, which specialized in the slave trade. The capital city was Xin-Haruka, a city carved into a cliffside which contained a substantial portal network to allow for easy transit. In total, there were 7 Runelords of Sloth: Zirie, Iltherius, Azaradni, Zalalet, Krenlith, Ivarina, and Kroon. Kroon was the only known Runelord to succeed his predecessor without violence. Beyond their shared interest in conjuration, several Runelords of Sloth were closely aligned with religious movements. Zirie was an agent of the demon lord Kolafir, while Kroon was the high priest of Lissala in the dying days of the Empire. The School of Abjuration focused on protective and counteractive magic, things like shields and counterspells. It's associated with the sin of envy, as the awareness of a foe's strengths induced a feeling of jealousy in the caster. Abjuration is also associated with the color green, as in green with envy, and the sky metal Noquil. The Runelords of Envy ruled over the nation of Edasiril in the northwest, a nation with good port access and which was highly defensible via land. The capital city of Xin-Edasiril was originally located at a major port city, but Runelord Belimarius established New Xin-Edasiril as her new capital during her reign. In total, there were 10 Runelords of Envy, as they were particularly good at assassinating their predecessors and seizing power. The 10 Runelords of Envy were Naft, Tanaris, Ivamura, Jura, Chalsardra, Ezedrea, Sarva, Desamelia, Ferrandi, and Belimarius. Belimarius was considered one of the weakest Runelords at the time of her reign, though she was still tremendously dangerous. Beyond their shared focus in abjuration, the Runelords of Envy maintained strong interests in economics, spycraft, trade, and government administration. The School of Illusion focused on the creation of things which weren't there, ranging from sights to sounds to smells. It was associated with the sin of pride, since illusionists had a tendency to cover up their flaws using magic. It was also associated with the color violet, and the sky metal orichalcum. The Runelord of Pride ruled over Xin-Eurythnia, the largest of the 7 Thassilonian member states, and a land filled with metropolitan trade centers. Xin-Eurythnia was the capital, tucked away in the Kodor Mountains and blanketed in grand illusions. There was only ever one Runelord of Pride, Xandergul, the unquestioned mightiest of the Runelords, and one of only 2 Runelords who was never overthrown. Xandergul was a figurehead for Thassilon as a whole after Xin's death, and once even tried to claim the throne of Aslant. Finally, the School of Enchantment focused on direct mental manipulation. It was associated with the sin of lust, for reasons I won't explore here. It was also associated with the color red and the sky metal Jezet. The Runelord of Lust ruled over Eurythnia, the southernmost of the Thassilonian member states, which hosted a substantial spice trade alongside a brothel industry which was the finest in the world. The capital city was Xin-Eurythnia, a grand city on the shores of a lake, dominated by a large black pyramid. Just like with Pride, there was only ever one Runelord of Lust, Sorshan, the only person whom Xandergul ever considered a threat. Sorshan ruled for the entirety of Thassilon's existence, and her interests included academic lecturing, the study of vampirism, and the development and collection of rare perfumes. With that basic understanding of the 7 schools and nations out of the way, I'll now do a quick rundown of the major events in the history of Thassilon. These aren't strictly in chronological order, since some of these events took multiple years and overlapped slightly, but broadly speaking, the events I discuss first came before the events I discuss last. Not long after the death of Xin, the Aslanti Empire grew wary of the chaotic and expansionist reign of the Runelords. After a failed diplomatic mission, when the Runelords threw the Aslanti diplomats out of Thassilon on pain of death, the Aslanti finally declared war. In their arrogance, the Runelords underestimated the might of the Aslanti. Only the capture and execution of Ivamura, 3rd Runelord of Envy, woke them up to the danger they faced. The grueling war finally ended when Gimel, the 3rd Runelord of Greed, summoned the legendary Oliphant of Jondelay. This titanic beast was a manifestation of apocalyptic energy, and as Gimel unleashed it upon the world, it laid waste to the armies of Aslant, though some of Thassilon's armies were destroyed as collateral damage. The Oliphant of Jondelay ended the war, and Gimel dismissed it, taking the secret of summoning it with him when he eventually died. The absence of a unifying external threat after the war only highlighted the internal tensions between the Runelords of Thassilon. It didn't take long for an arcane arms race to develop between the 7 kingdoms, best represented by the forging of the 7 swords of Sin. Sorshan began this particular race when she forged Ashaya, the Sword of Lust, a powerful artifact which empowered its wielder so they might serve as Sorshan's champion and greatest defender. The other 7 Runelords followed suit in the years which followed, each forging a Sword of Sin and naming a champion. While this competitive arms race proved effective for driving innovation, the Runelords soon recognized the need for neutral ground, where collaboration could flourish between the 7 nations, even during times of strife. As a solution, they created the Runeforge, a demiplane outside of the material plane which was warded against entry by the Runelords themselves. The Runeforge became the site of many of the arcane advancements made during the time of Thassilon. Of course, the arms race only continued, even after the development of the Runeforge. Tensions continued to escalate, and an all-out war between the Runelords soon seemed like an inevitability. This came to a head under the reign of Angathane, 2nd Runelord of Wrath. In his pursuit of power, Angathane had struck a bargain with Nocticula, the demon lord of Succubi. Nocticula, however, had machinations of her own, and manipulated Angathane into assassinating his rival Zirie, first runelord of Sloth. This nearly triggered an all-out war between the seven nations. Only the actions of Xandergul prevented such a conflict. Xandergul personally intervened and killed the three most aggressive surviving runelords, Angathane, Jura, the fourth runelord of Envy, and Atharend, the second runelord of Gluttony. While everyone always knew that Xandergul was the strongest of the runelords, this was the event which solidified his position in the minds of the general populace. Another way in which Xandergul established his unassailable power base was through his masterful manipulation of religion, economics, and politics. Early in his reign, Xandergul discovered the Peacock Spirit, a deity of rulership and magic. He established the faith of the Peacock Spirit as a major religion in Thassilon, and made Cyrusian the unofficial home of the faith. This allowed him to consolidate religious and social power, even outside his own borders. What none of the other runelords ever discovered, however, was that Xandergul himself was the Peacock Spirit. Xandergul had, in his quest for mythic power, acquired a divine spark, becoming a lesser deity capable of granting spells to clerics. He took up the identity of the Peacock Spirit in secret, obscuring the relationship he had with the new god. As an extension of his newfound religious power, Xandergul founded several orders of devout mages and warriors dedicated to the Peacock Spirit. These took root in all the member states of Shalast, giving Xandergul access to both a potent spy network and significant influence, right under the noses of his rivals. Of course, Xandergul wasn't the only runelord who constantly elevated his own power and might. In the latter half of the Thassilonian Empire, Alasnist and Karzug took power in Bakrakon and Shalast, respectively. Each of these two was the strongest runelord of their school of magic, and they absolutely hated one another. They went to war early on in their reigns, and this war eventually escalated to the point of threatening the entirety of Thassilon, at least according to popular opinion at the time. Famously, the border between Bakrakon and Shalast became a sort of Maginot Line, fortified with fire-spewing towers on one side and enormous observation statues on the other. Near the end of Thassilon, Alasnist gained an edge over Karzug with her increasing expertise in demonology and her mastery over flesh warping. Had Earthfall not happened when it did, she likely would have won the war. Speaking of which, Earthfall arrived in minus 5293 AR, bringing a cataclysmic end to the Thassilonian Empire. Of course, the runelords would never go quietly into the night. Sorshan, early in her reign, used her connection to a powerful artifact called the Everdawn Pool to craft a rune well, and shared this secret with her fellows. The rune well served as a receptacle for sin energy, and could absorb latent sins from the surrounding area. This allowed the runelords to use rune wells as arcane batteries to fuel magic experimentation, most famously with the creation of the Sin Spawn, aberrations infused with sin energy. The greatest ability of a rune well, however, was the creation of a sin-infused demiplane, a bolt hole into which a runelord could flee in times of great danger. As Earthfall approached, 4 of the runelords, Xandergul, Sorshan, Karzug, and Alasnist, fled into their rune wells. Belimarius attempted to do the same, but botched the crafting of her rune well, accidentally creating a pocket around her capital city, which isolated it outside of time in an amber structure called the Crystalline. Zutha, a lich, allowed his body to decay, convinced that his soul cage would bring him back. And Kroon trapped his soul inside a gemstone underground, his body preserved by magic. Unfortunately for the runelords, their arrogance blinded them to the severity of Earthfall's threat. The ensuing disaster annihilated society on Galarian's surface, eliminating any chance for the runelords' followers to activate the rituals necessary to bring them back. And so, Thassilon collapsed, and the legacy of the runelords went dormant for nearly 10,000 years. In the Age of Lost Omens, the runelords were the stuff of legend, and were largely forgotten, despite the presence of their ruins and their ancient monuments which dotted the landscape of Varisia. In 4705, however, the status quo changed. Karzug was partially awakened by the accidental actions of a wayward stone giant. and contacted his remaining few loyalists to begin the process of freeing himself from his Runewell demiplane. This involved the harvesting of greedy souls and the collection of greed energy into Karzug's Runewell. In response, a group of heroes originating in the seaside town of Sandpoint rose up to challenge the Runelord of Greed. These heroes traveled onto the Storval Plateau and uncovered the ancient Thoracic library, from which they learned of the Runeforge, and the process by which they could forge weapons capable of harming Karzug. They accessed the Runeforge and forged the weapons they needed, then made their way into the Kodor Mountains, searching for the mythical Xin-Shalast, the lost city of gold. Finding the city, the heroes entered Karzug's Runewell demiplane and faced the Runelord in combat. Karzug was defeated, and the heroes returned victorious to the material plane. Xin-Shalast would thereafter become a research hub for Thassilonian scholars. What the heroes failed to realize, however, was that the actions of Karzug had a knock-on effect, as energy from the Runewell sent arcane waves through the other Runewell networks around Varisia. Years later, the Pathfinder Society began establishing a foothold in Varisia. Agents of the PFS came into contact with the cult of Lissala, the goddess of rune magic, whose faith had been dead on Galarian since Thassilon's collapse. These Lissalans sought to restore the high priest of their religion, Kroon, the final rune lord of Sloth, to life in the Age of Lost Omens. The agents of the PFS began a sustained opposition effort against the cult, thwarting their harvesting of souls, their collection of ancient artifacts, and their gathering of ancient lore. The PFS finally confronted the Lissalan cultists in Kroon's tomb, and though Kroon himself was successfully awakened, the agents succeeded in defeating him and killing him once and for all. Still, this raised concern among the PFS leadership, and Venture Captain Sheila Hydemarch began searching for a weapon capable of fighting any other Runelords who might attempt to return. About a year later, Hydemarch assembled a new team of heroes to gather the shards of the Sihedron artifact, the device created by the first King Xin to demonstrate his mastery over the 7 schools of rune magic. These heroes collected the first 2 shards in Magnamar, in a research facility which Runelord Alasnist had created beneath the mighty Irespan Bridge. The heroes acquired the next shard in the Lady's Light, a towering lighthouse monument created by Runelord Sorshan. After this, the heroes traveled to Kaer Maga, the City of Strangers, and collected a shard which Karzug had stolen and hidden beneath the city. The heroes then traveled to Windsong Abbey, a site of religious cooperation which had recently been seized by cultists of Yamasoth. Exploring a hidden temple to Grotus beneath the abbey, the heroes discovered a plot to open a Doomsday Door, an artifact intended to unleash an apocalyptic disaster upon the surrounding area. The heroes stopped this plot and seized the Sihedron shard, which the mastermind behind it bore. They then moved back to the Storval Plateau, to the ancient ruin of Giltspur, a former laboratory of Karzug. Here they gathered the remaining 2 shards, one from a giant warlord and the other from a dragon, which had traveled through a portal to the nightmare realm of Leng. Finally, the heroes returned to Magnamar and assembled the Sihedron artifact, which unintentionally triggered the return of Old Lord Xin, and his palace and the island it was built upon rose from the sea floor. Xin had bound his soul to the Sihedron, and when it was reassembled, he was restored to unlife as a ghost. Traveling to the Isle of Xin, the heroes explored the Emperor's Crystal Palace, and eventually fought and permanently killed Xin himself. With the Sihedron in hand, the heroes returned to Magnamar, ready to face whatever threat arose from the ancient Thassilonian past. Several years later, Count Varian Jaeger was summoned to Korvosa by an old friend, the necromancer Professor Igreshta. Igreshta had stumbled upon the Cardosian Codex, one of the 3 fragments of Runelord Zutha's Soul Cage and spellbook, the Gluttonous Tome. The Count Jaeger and his companions traveled to Kaer Maga and collected the second portion of the tome, then moved on to the Sleeper, the site of Zutha's famous capital, the site of Zutha's former capital. During all of this, Count Jaeger became cursed by the tome. At the Sleeper, the group found the final book fragment, and Jaeger became fully possessed by Zutha's spirit. Jaeger's companions killed and resurrected him, removing the curse, but Professor Igreshta, who was secretly still alive, stole the gluttonous tome. Jagear and his allies followed Igreshta to the cenotaph, then fought him. Igreshta succeeded in transforming into the new undead vessel for Xutha's soul, but Jagear and his allies split the gluttonous tome apart once again, trapping Xutha in his tomb and leaving him to be consumed by ghouls, though his soul would live on. In 4716 AR, a Lasnist, final Runelord of Wrath, emerged from her Runewell dimension. She traveled to Xin-Eurythnia and followed up on the research started by Xandergul into the location of the mythical Scepter of Ages, an artifact said to enable time manipulation. A Lasnist succeeded in locating the Scepter of Ages, then used it to force Xandergul out of his Runewell dimension, at which point she killed him. A Lasnist then traveled back in time, manipulating the time stream to her benefit, and allowing her to absorb mythic power. The Sihedron heroes took notice of these manipulations, however, and took action to oppose her. They siphoned off some latent time energy from the crystalline, an amber structure preserving an ancient city outside of time in northwestern Varissia. The Sihedron heroes then traveled to the time stream and faced a Lasnist, but she defeated them, though it cost her the Scepter of Ages. Not long after, a group of heroes rose up in the small town of Roderick's Cove. After dealing with minor threats to their hometown, these heroes traveled to Magnamar and met with Sheila Hydemarch, who asked them to investigate Hollow Mountain in the absence of the Sihedron heroes. Investigating the mountain fortress, the heroes encountered not one but two cults, one devoted to Yamasoth and the other devoted to the Peacock Spirit, an ancient Thassilonian deity who hadn't been worshipped since Earthfall. From here, the heroes traveled around Varissia, attempting to undermine the activities of these and other Runelord-associated cults. They cut off an attempt to resurrect Xutha when, with the help of a newly awakened Runelord Sorshan, they destroyed a portion of the gluttonous tome once and for all on the Isle of Xin. Sorshan then directed the heroes to the Kodor Mountains, where they invaded the Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit. Here, the heroes confronted none other than Xandergul himself, who had survived the attempt on his life and reincarnated into a living illusory body. The heroes defeated Xandergul in his new mortal body, sending his soul to the afterlife. Then the heroes entered the crystalline, which was in truth Xin-Eurythnia. Here, the heroes found the Sihedron artifact, and the heroes who wielded it, frozen in time. The new heroes freed these allies and all of Xin-Eurythnia from outside of time, bringing the entire city and its thousands of inhabitants, Runelord Belimarius included, into the present. At this point, the heroes understood the threat posed by a Lasnist, and the need to undo her meddling in time. They traveled to the afterlife, and questioned Runelord Karzug to learn how to operate the Cyphergate, a time manipulation device which he helped design. At this point, the heroes witnessed the soul of Xandergul be sacrificed to the vast eclipse which hangs over Abaddon, the realm of the daemons. Operating the Cyphergate, the heroes entered the dimension of time, at which point they were able to travel the time stream and undo the machinations of a Lasnist. This included an attempt to bring the Oliphant of Jondelay into the Age of Lost Omens. Eventually, the heroes and a Lasnist were forced into a pocket dimension, where they needed to fight one another to the death so they might resolve the paradox caused by their conflicting existences. The heroes eventually emerged victorious from their fight, a Lasnist's soul being torn asunder by the numerous demons and Qliphoth with whom she'd made deals. The time stream restored, the heroes returned to Varissia. In the 5 years since a Lasnist's demise, the two living Runelords, Sorshan and Belimarius, have established a new nation, New Thassilon. Sorshan rules in the east from Xin-Shalast, the former capital city of Karzug, which she recently renamed Xin-Eurythnia. Her rule is defined in large part by her faith in Nocticula, the Redeemer Queen, and she is seeking to establish Eurythnia as a land for outcasts, artists, refugees, and those seeking to leave behind the sins of their past. In the west, Belimarius rules from Xin-Eurythnia, and her ambition is as voracious as ever. Having reconstituted her armies, she's begun to expand her territory, claiming the Mierani Forest and portions of the lands of the Lenorm kings. With the God's Reign, the tension between Belimarius and Sorshan has ratcheted up even further, as each archmage has scrambled to claim as many of Gorham's war shards as possible. One particular war shard, the Trinity Star, recently crashed into the Koror Mountains and has yet to be found. This shard, named for the 3 tails it trailed as it fell from the sky, promises to be a tremendously powerful artifact to whoever claims it, and many suspect that the quest for it might finally push Sortion and Belimarius to open war. This comes at a time when additional Thassilonian secrets are beginning to come to light in wider Varissia. Namely, rumors have begun to swirl about a supposed ancient archwizard whose remains were located somewhere near the former border of Shalast and Bakrakhan, in the vicinity of modern Magnamar. While much of this information remains to be confirmed by sources like Sortion, a name has begun to circulate: Liralaru. Whatever this Liralaru was up to, she's certainly begun to stir up interest among scholars of Thassilonian history and magic. Xin-Eurythnia Today. Revenge of the Runelords begins in Xin-Eurythnia, the new name for Karzug's former capital city of Xin-Shalast. In an attempt to rebrand her new capital city and draw interest from outside investors, mundane as that sounds, Sortion has officially renamed the city. This rebranding effort has been significant. Sortion has actively cleared the main sections of the city of danger, and has courted merchants, historians, arcane researchers, and Nocticulan priests from all around Avestan and beyond to come and settle her city. Much of this aggressive recruitment and urban development is prompted by the relative success Belimarius has found in recruiting new denizens for Xin-Edasiril, due to its extreme wealth of historic artifacts and its excellent coastal position as a trading hub. Sortion is much less combative and violent than Belimarius, which makes her attractive as a ruler, but she's facing a significant challenge in her efforts: location. Xin-Eurythnia is located deep within the Kodor Mountains, in one of the most inhospitable regions on all of Golarion. Even getting to the city is a hazardous trip for most people, as the freezing temperatures, thin air, and numerous terrain hazards and wild fauna can easily kill even prepared travelers. Sortion first addressed these issues by constructing a series of climate control towers surrounding the lower city. These towers increase the temperature and oxygen levels in the portions of the city most suitable for habitation and trade, ensuring that regular merchants, workers, and general residents can live safely without the need for regular spellcasting services or powerful magic items. Next, Sortion established her city as the headquarters of the Nocticulan Church on Golarion. The faith of the Redeemer Queen is likely the greatest political power in the city, behind only Sortion herself. The church is based out of the former House of Divine Consumption, the temple devoted to the sin of greed as a philosophy, which has been repurposed. Now called Midnight's Gallery, the temple is managed by a small army of artist priests, led by the High Priestess Ayava. Ayava should be familiar to anyone who played through Return of the Runelords. Though Sortion herself is certainly Nocticula's greatest champion on Golarion, she has little interest in flexing that religious power, and feels it is more appropriate to delegate her responsibility as church leader to Ayava, who is more than capable. In establishing the Nocticulan Church as the major religion in the city, Sortion also set up Eurythnia as the ultimate haven for outcasts. The Nocticulan Church accepts all those who seek to genuinely leave behind the evils of their past, making Sortion's nation a home for both those seeking redemption and those fleeing tyranny. While numerous artists have been drawn to the church, as many or more refugees have sought safety under Sortion's protection. Orcs fleeing from Belkzen have been especially numerous in recent years, as the threat of Tar-Baphon has risen in the east. Still, even with these efforts, Sortion has been unable to draw the level of investment needed to firmly establish Xin-Eurythnia as the economic and political powerhouse she desires, to ensure that she can overtake Belimarius's recent gains. So, she recently unveiled a new plan. The Circle of Open Hands is a massive portal being constructed to connect Xin-Eurythnia directly to Absalom, the largest city in the Inner Sea region. This would turn Xin-Eurythnia into a regional trading hub, ensuring that Sortion's city would easily outstrip Xin-Edasiril. Once this initial portal has been established, Sortion also plans to add new destinations to the network, including locations as far away as the Magambia. In this, Sorshin appears to be drawing direct inspiration from the Ayudara network of the elves, following in the footsteps of Xin when he drew inspiration from them to develop rune magic all those millennia ago. The campaign kicks off as the final preparations for the Circle of Open Hands are underway. In a few days' time, the portal will be unveiled, and goods will begin flowing freely from far-off Absalom. In preparation for this, many of Sorshin's most trusted and powerful servants have shipped off to Absalom, and are busy preparing the linked portal there. Sorshin herself has remained within her capital, overseeing preparations herself. As far as I can tell, the anti-teleportation defenses which protected Xin Shalast under the Lords of Greed are still in effect, meaning Sorshin cannot easily warp between the two locations. Circumnavigating these magical wards was likely the greatest arcane challenge which Sorshin faced in constructing the Circle of Open Hands. With a few days before the opening ceremony, the PCs will have time to get to know Xin-Eurythnia. The campaign makes it clear that they can perform a few downtime activities before the campaign proper begins. So, even as new arrivals, there is certain information about the city's cultural landscape with which they would likely be familiar. Queen Sorshin is, of course, the primary power in the city. She rules from the Blood Moon Palace, a site which was once Shah Halaria, the seat of power for the rune giants in the lower city. She has specifically avoided occupying Karzug's spires, or the Pinnacle of Avarice, which overlooks the city from farther up the mountain. Instead, Sorshin prefers to remain closer to her people, emphasizing the break with Thassilonian traditions which her new outlook represents. Within her Blood Moon Palace, Sorshin houses her private archives, which contain the vast majority of her magical research notes, as well as many of her most powerful artifacts and magic items. It's also likely that she keeps her Runewell of Lust, or more specifically the anima focus which grants access to it, within her palace, though what it looks like or where it is a closely guarded secret. Despite her unquestioned personal power, Sorshin has not elected to rule tyrannically over her city. She has seen fit to delegate much of her personal influence to several factions within the city. The first of these I already mentioned, the Church of Nocticula. While not a state religion in an official capacity, the Nocticulan Church, under the leadership of High Priestess Ayava, is extraordinarily influential. The other three factions seem to have powers which are less far-reaching, but which are extremely focused in their appeal. The first of these three factions are the New Runelords. The New Runelords is my name for the students of rune magic who've cropped up in Xin-Eurythnia in recent years. A whole new crop of young wizards has flocked to Sorshin's banner, drawn by the promise of arcane understanding. These new Runelords see the title of Runelord as a badge of honor, and use it as a term which simply delineates any student of rune magic. These scholars operate within the city as a sort of arcane college, with deliberate parallels in the narrative drawn between these students and undergrad and graduate students in the real world. While Sorshin often teaches within this collegiate system, there are many other faculty members who've risen to prominence. The leader of this faction, at least when Sorshin isn't asserting control, is the elf Jathariel Five-Runes, an accomplished academic. The next faction in the city are the Merchants, led by the Lamia matriarch Sonrasi. The Merchant faction is quite broad, representing anyone with an explicitly financial interest in Xin-Eurythnia. This might include simple food vendors, or those who mine the nearby mountains for rare ores. It also, however, includes those who deal in much rarer or more specialized goods, ancient relics, restored clockwork, gemstones, magical or antique books, and so on. While the members of this faction might individually have diverse desires and needs, they all benefit from a stable economy. The pending arrival of the Circle of Open Hands presents an incredible financial opportunity for even the poorest established merchants in the city to reinvent themselves as ground-floor investors in one of the richest cities in the world. The final major faction within the city is the Giants, the collection of all giant residents of Xin-Eurythnia. These giants primarily reside in Jotunberg, the neighborhood which had once housed Karzug's giant laborers and soldiers. The modern giant residents of Jotunberg are treated as equal citizens, but their incredible size and physical adaptability provide them with specific needs and specific contributions they can make to life in the city. These giants generally function as laborers and artisans, repairing or constructing the immense buildings within the city. Many are also employed by Sortian or other leaders as soldiers and guards, and frost giants in particular can regularly be seen patrolling the streets. The leader of the giants in Xin-Eurythnia is Vokshar, a powerfully built frost giant. Notably, frost giants are not the largest or strongest giants in the city, so that Vokshar has been chosen as the leader is a testament to his skill and talent. Like I mentioned already, the players have access to some unique downtime activities which they can undertake within Xin-Eurythnia prior to the start of the campaign proper. These are described in detail in the official Player's Guide, available for free online. I won't detail them here, but I do have a suggestion. The downtime activities are interesting, but they aren't really enough to allow the players to become familiar with the city, or to connect to its residents. I suggest talking to your GM and coming to an agreement on how you want to complement these. Personally, I like the idea of using these activities as prompts for the players to write a 1- or 2-page introduction to their character, which they can then read aloud at the start of the campaign. But, of course, not every group would enjoy that, so sit down with your friends and just come to a consensus as a group. Advice and options for player characters. Alright, now it's time to discuss some player-facing topics you can use to help build your characters for Revenge of the Runelords. First things first, this campaign starts your characters off at level 12, which is much higher than most character building experiences players will have. At level 12, you will have many decisions to make regarding your character, including skill, ancestry, and class feats. If you haven't played a spellcaster before, I wouldn't recommend this as your first time to try it out. On top of feat, skill proficiency, and spell choices, Revenge is a mythic campaign. You as a player will need to make choices regarding your mythic calling, your mythic feats, and your eventual mythic destiny. This is a lot of choices presented to players, and I strongly suggest putting some serious thought into your character and build in advance of Session 0. At the risk of stating the obvious, this AP is not intended for players new to the system. Looking at equipment, you can choose to receive a lump sum of 4,500 GP and then pay for all your gear by item. Or, and this is the shortcut described in the GM core, you can instead receive 1 permanent 11th level item, 2 permanent 10th level items, 1 permanent 9th level item, and 2 permanent 8th level items, in addition to a lump sum of 700 GP, which can be spent on permanent items up to 7th level or consumable items of up to 12th level. Also, because this is a mythic campaign, mythic items are, at least may be, available to PCs. They shouldn't be available at the start of the campaign for plot reasons, but talk to your GM if that's something you're interested in. Moving on to something a little more fun, a wide variety of ancestries could work really well in this AP, from a thematic perspective. Now, I want to start out by saying that this AP is not intended for aquatic PCs, but if you are dead set on playing something with a swim speed, there is one dungeon in particular where you could really shine. Beyond that, however, you will not have a chance to use your aquatic abilities. By contrast, large PCs will do just fine in most of the maps in this campaign. With a few exceptions, the maps in this AP tend to be quite large and open. Honestly, sometimes a bit too open, meaning large PCs could work well in most situations. There are also a high number of non-combat challenges throughout this AP, where large-sized PCs will have no issues with size constraints at all. With all that in mind, let's talk shop. The campaign begins in New Thassilon, and despite the nation's high levels of diversity, humans are still the most numerous ancestry. Of the human ethnicities, the 4 most relevant to the story are the Thassilonians, who were likely pulled forward in time in the Crystalline, the Ulfin, whose independence in the lands of the Lenorm kings is threatened by Belimarius, or the Varisians and Shoanti, the native peoples of Varisia whose ancestors were enslaved by the Runelords. Beyond humans, elves and Ayuvarin are also somewhat common in the former lands of Thassilon. Most relevant to this story are the elves of the Mierani Forest, whose land is currently claimed by Runelord Belimarius, much to their frustration. Dwarves drawn to New Thassilon likely hail from the sky citadel of Yanderhof, near Korvosa, and might be compelled to the region by the rich mineral deposits in the Kodor Mountains. Orcs and Dromar have recently been settling in Eurythnia in large numbers, with the blessings of both Sortian and Ardax the Whitehair, mostly to escape the rising threat of Tar-Bathon to the east. Finally, gnomes, goblins, and halflings are all native to Varisia and exist in significant numbers. Gnomes and goblins might be drawn to New Thassilon for the many wondrous treasures and discoveries to be found in the ruins of the old empire. Halflings, meanwhile, might simply be drawn by Sortion's interest in art, or the light political touch she uses with her subjects. Beyond these core ancestries, a number of rarer ancestry and heritage options might present significant thematic connections to Thassilon and its history, making for characters with a deeper intrinsic tie to the story. Kolo, once called gnolls, are relatively rare in Avestan today, but this was not always the case. In ancient times, the Kolo were employed in large numbers by the Runelords of Sloth as their enforcers and slave catchers. While many modern Kolo have distanced themselves from this stereotype of slaving, it might be fun to play a Kolo character interested in examining the history of their distant ancestors. Another fun option might be to play an elemental scion, with a connection to one of the 4 elements understood in the days of Thassilon. Bear in mind that the planes of wood and metal had been hidden at the time. Bakrakhan in specific, under the rulership of Elasnist, pursued the art of elemental infusion, so it's entirely possible that some of their ancient magic has reawakened, or has reactivated and infused new targets in the Age of Lost Omens. At the same time, Shalast is known for rich ore deposits, so the influence of earth or metal elementals might be high in the region now that Sortion has opened it for business once again. Elasnist also made extensive use of flesh warping during her time in power, and her meddling with time may have brought certain flesh-warped experiments from the ancient past into the future once again, making the flesh warp ancestry a potentially interesting choice. Thinking about the campaign more broadly, dragons play a significant role in the story, and Dragonblood PCs with a connection to Omen or Mirage dragons in specific will certainly have moments to shine in the story. An off-the-wall idea relating to the history of ancient Thassilon might be to reflavor the automaton or puppet ancestries as awoken clockwork creations. Thassilonian clockwork was extremely advanced, especially that produced by Xin and a few other Runelords. By reflavoring the automaton or puppet ancestries, you could reasonably play one of these clockwork creations without too much dissonance. Perhaps your character was awoken by the God's Reign. Speaking of, the God's Reign resulted in a significant number of new Nephilim on Golarion. Battle-blooded Nephilim will share a connection with the recently deceased Gorum, while Hellspawn or Pit-born Nephilim might trace their lineage back to the demons or devils bound to the Runelords of old. Moving on to the classes players might consider for their characters, I've taken a slightly different approach than I normally do with these videos. Revenge of the Runelords feels very much like a classic Runelords AP, by which I mean to say that a huge number of classes could be extremely effective due to the focus on a broad range of skills, fun dungeon delving, and varied combat. For that reason, I've split my class recommendations into 2 sections: classes which have a potential thematic connection to the story built into their mechanics, and classes which don't have such an inherent connection but could still be extremely effective. The intention here is to make it clear for players, if you want a thematic connection to the story, but want to play one of the mechanical classes, you'll just want to build a thematic connection into your ancestry, religion, or backstory in some other way. So, starting off with the combat-focused martial classes. The Superstition Instinct Barbarian could be a great option, especially for characters who violently oppose the resurgent magic of the Runelords. At the same time, dragons play an important role in the story, so the Dragon Instinct, especially if tied to Omen or Mirage dragons, could be an excellent option for barbarians as well. With a high-level mythic campaign, the Exemplar is, unsurprisingly, a great option as well. This story is very much a tale of gods and monsters, so the demigod-adjacent powers of the Exemplar are a great fit for the narrative. Because this is a campaign focused on the Runelords of Thassilon and their mastery of Sin magic, a marshal who can incorporate arcane magic into their build will also be a great fit. The Magus excels in this regard, and Magus players could connect their hybrid study to the traditional Thassilonian magic, or their choice of weapon to one of the classic Thassilonian polearms or swords. The Summoner can choose eidolons related to the days of ancient Thassilon. The Anger or Devotion Phantoms might represent lost souls from the ancient days whose lingering feelings about the Runelords have connected them to their summoner. The Construct Eidolon, by contrast, might be connected to ancient Thassilonian clockwork, and the arcane spells it grants to its summoner might easily be interpreted as rune magic. Lastly, the champion could be extremely effective and thematic, but that is highly dependent on your choice of deity. More on the gods later. Looking at the strictly mechanically effective classes, both the Fighter and the Guardian might be great options for this AP, and could choose to focus on one of the many classic Thassilonian swords or polearms. The Swashbuckler could be a great choice, providing both martial skill for the combat portions of the AP and skill coverage for the social challenges. The Gunslinger could be effective, though one dungeon might prove especially challenging, and it might be fun to flavor the guns as an evolution of Thassilonian clockwork, or Magitech, especially with the way of the spell shot. Both the Ranger and the Monk could be powerful options as well, as both are flexible classes which could be built for a variety of party compositions or challenge types. Moving on to the skill-focused martial classes, the first one which stands out is the Thaumaturge. Ancient Thassilon left behind thousands of magical artifacts, which could serve as implements, and the tome, shield, amulet, weapon, or regalia implements could be particularly useful in this AP. The Inventor, meanwhile, might connect their invention to a new development in Thassilonian clockwork technology, possibly related to the return of the Isle of Xin. The Alchemist might connect their alchemy to the many alchemical specializations developed and practiced in Shalast and Bakrakhan. Both the Inventor and the Alchemist might bring flexibility to parties with alchemical items or gadgets. The Runesmith, while still technically in development, promises to be the perfect support class for this campaign, with the runes of the class easily connecting to the runes of ancient Thassilon. Looking at the strictly mechanically effective classes, the Rogue is, of course, a great choice for its complete dominance of skill proficiencies. The Investigator is also effective, and will certainly have some mystery solving to perform after the opening chapters of the story. Similarly, the Commander will be effective in combat in a party of 5 or more PCs, but will also have moments to explore their mastery over warfare lore around the midpoint of the AP. Now, moving on to the spellcasters, there are many classes which have a thematic connection to the story. Most prominently, the Wizard is the perfect fit for players wanting to follow in the steps of the Runelords. The Ars Grammatica and Unified Magical Theory schools are great for wizards studying rune magic and the origins of magic in general, but the premier option here is definitely the Runelord class archetype, as presented in rival academies. Animists might connect to the themes of the story by choosing the Crafter in the Vault, the Echo of Lost Moments, or the Steward of Stone and Fire apparitions. Bards could take advantage of the social or lore challenges in this campaign with the Enigma or Polymath muses, especially if they treat Sortian or Nocticula as their muse. Sorcerers have a number of bloodlines which might connect to the story. The Imperial bloodline is connected to ancient archmages, while the Aesir bloodline might have been awoken by Gorham's blood during the God's Reign. The Harrow bloodline will connect a character to Varisian culture and the history of Thassilon, while the Shadow bloodline might connect to illusion spells, a classic Thassilonian school of arcane study. The Draconic bloodline, especially when connected to Omen or Mirage dragons, could be a great option as well. Witches with a divine patron could be a good option, depending on your character's choice of deity, while the Spinner of Threads patron could connect to the idea of destiny and fate, and the Resentment patron could connect to the hatred felt by the long-lost souls of ancient Thassilon, who were destroyed or dominated by the Runelords. Also, this campaign is the perfect opportunity for the Seneschal class archetype for witches, as the ascension to patron status aligns nicely with the themes of gods and monsters in this story. While not my favorite class, the Oracle could be fun here, especially with the Ancestors mystery connecting to ancient Thassilon, the Lore mystery connecting to Thassilonian lore, and the Time mystery connecting to the Crystalline and the time-related antics of Elasnist. Lastly, the Cleric is always great, and can be fantastically thematic, assuming you make a good choice of deity. Looking at the strictly mechanically effective spellcasters, the Kineticist could be fun and effective, especially in the combat portions of the story. Most of the elements will have moments to shine, with Wood probably being the least connected. The Psychic is fairly disconnected from Thassilonian magic, but is still strong and fun. Psychic subclasses focusing on illusions, enchantments, or divinations might connect to specific story elements at certain points in the story. Lastly, while the Druid doesn't have much of a thematic connection to the story, there are certain challenges which a mastery over primal magic might prove very capable of resolving. Now I want to talk about archetypes. Normally, I break archetypes out with classes, but this time I've decided to group them all together. This is the rare AP where I don't recommend at least considering free archetype, due to the inclusion of Mythic in its place. So, archetypes will probably be less used here than in other stories. That said, a few still stand out as potentially useful, thematic, or both. The archaeologist, for example, will be great at exploring ancient dungeons and unraveling old mysteries, which is a significant aspect of this story. The Blessed One archetype is great at providing healing to the party, and blessings from the gods fit in nicely with the epic nature of this AP. The flexible spellcaster or wellspring mage archetypes might appeal to some players, and could be flavored as a new understanding in arcane theory, which connects to the evolving understanding of rune magic in the Age of Lost Omens. The Harrower, while extremely specific, is connected to the Varisian peoples, who should be inherently opposed to the violent resurgence of the wicked Runelords. The Loremaster could help parties cover a variety of niche lore skills, which the campaign presents. The Medic is, as always, great at keeping the party alive, though may be less necessary than normal depending on the mythic abilities the party employs. The various archetypes associated with the Pathfinder Society could connect to the story of Shattered Star and the Year of the Risen Rune, which could be fun for players who've played through those previous adventures. The Ritualist could be helpful for a few rituals which crop up in the story, but won't be critical if the party is well balanced in terms of skills. The Runescarred archetype has a lot of potential to give a thematic connection to characters descended from the Varisian or Shoanti peoples, but your GM will need to rule on the new classifications of spells available to the archetype, based on the abandonment of spell schools in the remaster. Both the Spell Trickster and the Scroll Trickster could connect to new developments in Thassilonian rune magic, shortcutting traditional magical practice to develop new arcane exploits to employ. Finally, the Time Mage archetype could connect to Elasnist's various time manipulations in recent years, and the recent return of Xin-Eurythnia to the time stream. Now let's shift gears and look at the deities which might offer a thematic narrative connection to the story. Revenge as a story is not centered around any one faith, but there are still a few of particular note to consider. The first noteworthy deity is certainly Nocticula, the Redeemer Queen, who serves as the patron deity of Queen Sortian and her territory of Eurythnia. Nocticula's church holds significant sway in Xin-Eurythnia, where the story begins, though it will have less relevance to the story in Book 2. Lysala, the patron goddess of Thassilonian rune magic, could be an excellent choice as well. Her benevolent incarnation as the Order of Virtue would likely be preferred for most players, but the Sihedron Scion could be interesting as well, in a party more willing to tolerate evil. Desna is the goddess of travel, the night, and dreams, and is extremely popular among the Varisian peoples, and the Lyrune-Qua subset of the Shoanti. Travel and dreams are both prominent themes in this campaign, boosting Desna's importance to the plot even further. Lastly, Nethys, the god of magic, could be an excellent choice for characters interested in studying rune magic, and the other powers of ancient Thassilon. Other deities of magic, like Yulral, Nalinivati, or Sivana, might fit this niche as well. Beyond these listed options, most non-evil deities could work well in this campaign, with special attention given to deities who endorse freedom and oppose tyranny. Obvious options include Cadencalion, Shelyn, Sarenrae, Iomide, Ashava, Arshay, Apsu, Milani, and dozens upon dozens of others. In the wake of the God's reign, the death of Gorum, the god of war, has shaken the Inner Sea region to its core. It could be interesting, if challenging, to role-play a follower or former follower of the Lord in Iron. That's certainly a character motivation I would like to explore in a high-level mythic campaign, especially with some of the crazy mythic destinies and high-level mythic feats players can expect to take. More on those a little later in this video. Before I leave this section, there are some deities which players absolutely should not worship in this campaign, unless they get pre-approval from the GM and everyone at the table is willing to put in some serious work to make the narrative function as intended. First, you shouldn't play a character who worships a deity of the end times, or who would otherwise seek the end of the world. The most notable of these are Grotus and Rovagug, both of whom are terrible fits for this campaign. This might also include a few lesser-known deities of apocalypse, like that weird black hole thing that showed up in Divine Mysteries. Characters who worship these apocalyptic deities are going to face serious motivational conflicts in this AP. Up next, the Peacock Spirit, the lesser deity of rulership, magic, and self-perfection, worshipped in Cyreusian and the broader Thassilonian Empire, would be an absolutely awful fit for this campaign. Though the Peacock Spirit was briefly active on Galarian again in 4718 AR, its faith has since returned to dormancy. If you've watched my previous videos in this SinMas series, you might be able to guess why the Peacock Spirit might be a poor choice of deity, but for those of you who want to go in blind, I won't say anything more here. Suffice it to say, following the Peacock Spirit will cause serious motivational problems in this campaign. Now, I'm moving on to something new for this series, Mythic Callings. I've never covered a Mythic campaign before, so this is a first for me. For those unaware, the Mythic system in Pathfinder 2e breaks your character progression into two sections: your Mythic Calling, which defines your origins, and your Mythic Destiny, which defines the heights to which your character will ascend. Mythic Callings largely provide you with a means of acquiring Mythic points by performing specific skill actions, while Mythic Destinies generally provide you with new means of spending your Mythic points to accomplish new impressive effects. Because of the broad nature of the narrative, Revenge of the Runelords presents a great opportunity for most, if not all, of the Mythic Callings presented in War of Immortals. The only ones which might struggle slightly are the Artisan, the Thespian, and the Thief. Artisans might lack meaningful crafting opportunities, unless someone in the party has a shield. Thespians might lack opportunities to perform, unless they are a bard or battle dancer swashbuckler. And thieves may lack opportunities to pick a lock, unless they work with their GM to broaden the definition to include disarming traps. In addition to the callings from War of Immortals, Revenge of the Runelords also presents 4 new callings: the Doomsayer, the Dreamer, the Runelord, and the Saga. The Doomsayer's calling is focused on the idea of prophecy and the forthcoming end of the world. The Doomsayer is focused on forestalling the end of the world by helping their allies and consoling the wounded or dying. You can spend a Mythic point to repair items or administer first aid at Mythic proficiency. The first time each day you critically succeed at such a check, you regain a Mythic point. The Dreamer is tied to the dimension of dreams, a plane of existence sometimes called the Dreamlands. Your dreams are incredibly vivid, and you can draw upon them for inspiration. You can spend a Mythic point to recall knowledge with the 4 magic skills at Mythic proficiency, or to make crafting checks. The first time each day you crit succeed on one of these checks, you regain a Mythic point. The Runelord is the calling for characters with some connection to ancient Thassilon. Perhaps your soul reincarnated from a Thassilonian wizard, or perhaps your bloodline traces back to the ancient Runelords themselves. Regardless, your connection is strong. You can spend a Mythic point to identify magic, perform a ritual, or learn a spell in order to perform the check at Mythic proficiency. The first time each day you critically succeed at such a check, you regain a Mythic point. The Saga's calling is the most broad, and represents characters who live their lives guided by the myriad ancient legends of the Saga lands. You can attempt performance checks or checks to gather information at Mythic proficiency, and the first time each day you critically succeed at one of those checks, you regain a Mythic point. Growing beyond their Mythic callings, characters will quickly begin unlocking their Mythic destinies. Even though they start at level 12, PCs will not technically begin the campaign with access to their first Mythic Destiny feat. But fear not, your characters will pick this feat up very quickly, so you won't have to wait long before being able to use those impressive powers. Revenge of the Runelords presents 4 new Mythic Destinies specific to this campaign, in addition to those available in War of Immortals. The 4 new ones are Avenging Runelord, the Heroic Scion, Time-Racked, and the War-Shard Warrior. The Avenging Runelord is definitely my favorite, as its flavor and connection to the setting of Thassilon and Erysia is top-notch. Your character has become bound to the lingering soul of one of the long-dead Runelords of Thassilon. There are almost 40 viable candidates, with only a few off-limits, so talk to your GM if you have one of the Runelords in mind. This destiny is great for both marshals and spellcasters, offering access to powerful innate spells and special tricks and perks for those who wield weapons in the polearm group. Please note, however, that James Jacobs himself has stated that he likes the house rule of the innate spells from this mythic destiny keying off whatever mental stat the character wants, instead of just charisma. Personally, I think James is 100% right on this one. They shouldn't just key off charisma automatically. Heroic Scion is the next new destiny, and this is probably my least favorite of the bunch. Your character is the inheritor of the legacy of another legendary hero from Varisia's past, be they a PC from a previous adventure or an NPC from any point in the region's history. The old character may be dead and gone, but your PC holds their potential, and might be the key to closing out their story. While I like this conceptually, I struggle to identify with the mechanics of this destiny. The feats are extremely broad, covering an enormous range of character types, leaving it with little in the way of mechanical identity. Additionally, this destiny doesn't feel especially strong. The one thing Heroic Scion has going for it is that any character concept could potentially make this work. So if none of the other destinies fit your character, this has the flexibility to make it land. Up next is Time Racked, and this one is just cool. Your character has traveled non-linearly through time, likely due to the events of Return of the Runelords. For that reason, you maintain a strong connection to the dimension of time, and can manipulate time to tremendous effect. The flavor of this mythic destiny is absolutely fantastic, and is deeply rooted in the setting of Varisia, and the mechanics more than back this up. This is easily the most complicated mythic destiny to play, however, as it grants the player access to some metagaming powers, which will require careful tracking at the table. You might even be able to lock GM-controlled enemies into specific actions. Otherwise, this destiny allows your character to move more quickly, improve their chances of a critical hit, making this even greater on fighters and gunslingers, or improve the results of their saving throws. Overall, I like this a little better on a martial than a caster, but casters will have plenty to work with as well. Lastly, we have the Warshard Warrior, another option which is absolutely dripping with flavor, backed up by some decent mechanical power. The hook here is that your character has been implanted with a lesser war shard of Gorum, the deceased god of war. This allows you to manifest a connection with a weapon of your choosing, granting you access to new abilities. This is especially great for martials, since it gives the ability to see through the eyes of the weapon, access to some decent AoE attacks, and a multi-target strike. I only have 2 issues with this destiny. First, it is tied to the lore of Galarian, but not super closely tied to Thassilonian lore specifically. Not a huge issue, but worth mentioning. Second, the capstone feat just feels weird to me. It's not bad, I wanted something more, and this isn't what I was hoping for. Beyond these 4 new Mythic Destinies, players also have access to all the original Mythic Destinies presented in War of Immortals. Of the original options, I've listed 5 here which I think align nicely with the themes of this adventure path. The Ascended Celestial Destiny allows your character to manifest the power of the Imperial Celestials of the Outer Rifts, Angels, Archons, Azatas, and Agathians. The Broken Chain is all about overthrowing tyrants and oppressors, a storyline for your character which will be a great fit for this campaign. The Godling Destiny allows your character to ascend to a level of divinity on their own, culminating in ascending to the level of a minor god, capable of granting spells to followers, which could make for a fascinating contrast to a certain plotline in this AP. The Wild Spell is for characters who act as a conduit of raw magical power, a force which is certainly tied closely to the history of Thassilon and rune magic. The Mortal Herald is kind of an odd case, since it could be partially accessed by non-mythic characters, but it is a valid option. Mortal Heralds are characters who could become the direct agents of their god, an appropriately mythic goal for heroes in this story. Each of these destinies has fantastic parallels with the themes and storylines present in this AP, though I'm hesitant to go too much farther without getting into spoilers. As much as I love the power and flavor of the Archfiend or the Apocalypse Rider, they aren't great fits for this AP, since they very much tend toward evil characters, who will struggle to perform the heroic acts which this AP expects of players. And, finally, we come to the backgrounds available to players in Revenge of the Runelords. Like all Paizo APs, Revenge provides unique backgrounds intended to tie your character to the story, setting, or themes of the campaign. In the case of Revenge, 6 backgrounds have been provided. Instead of a skill feat, these backgrounds instead present you with a unique special ability tied to your history. The distant traveler background is quite broad. Your character comes from a distant land, certainly from outside of Avestan. Your newness to the region, coupled with the unique perspective that brings and the speed with which you've gained renown in the Saga lands, has drawn the attention of Queen Sorshan, earning you an invitation to the Circle of Open Hands ceremony. You are trained in diplomacy and mercantile lore due to your distant travels. Your special ability is, whenever you travel more than 100 miles, you gain a +1 status bonus to will saves for 8 hours. Bear in mind, this is very much a road trip campaign, so this situation could come up surprisingly frequently. The Escaped from Time background represents characters who were born before Earthfall, and became trapped in Xin-Eurythnia when Belimarius accidentally trapped it outside of time in the Crystalline. Having emerged into the Age of Lost Omens, you've left the world you know behind. This new land is strange and unfamiliar, but the support of your friends has kept you going. You are trained in occultism and architecture lore, the former likely to try to understand the mechanics of the time magic which carried you to the new world. As a special ability, you may always roll occultism for initiative, and gain a +2 circumstance bonus on such rolls. This is an insanely powerful ability. Please note, while this background is thematically close to the time-racked mythic destiny, there's nothing saying that a character with one must choose the other. The heroic ancestry background is, again, fairly broad. Your character is closely related to another famous hero from the Saga lands, or other nearby regions. Your relative, who might be a sibling, parent, or other relation decided by you, might have inspired your own life of adventure. Sorshan has reached out to your character, but has made it clear that you, not your famous relative, are the one whose destiny she's keen to observe. This is a great opportunity for you, the player, to be the child of a previous PC, perhaps the heroes of Rise of the Runelords, since that took place 18 years ago. Characters with this background are trained in athletics and library lore, likely inspired by the varied heroics in the stories of their relatives' many great exploits. As a special ability, you reduce the DC of various social checks and influence encounter checks by 2, as people are impressed by the heroics of your relative, and how you are living up to or even exceeding their legend. Bear in mind, there are a lot of influence encounters in this campaign. The local savior background is really cool, and I like what Paizo did here. Your character is a local hero to one of the many small communities around the Saga lands. The text of the background provides 5 example communities, but makes it clear that you can choose a different community with GM permission. Many of these communities are tied to previous Runelord APs, so it could be a great opportunity to play a character who was a minor NPC in a previous campaign at your table. Depending on your choice of community, you gain a different mechanical benefit in the form of an innate divine cantrip, in addition to being trained in religion and art lore. Ilsurian is the first of the 5 listed communities, and is a small town of about 700 inhabitants, which is briefly passed through by the heroes of Rise of the Runelords. Osprey Cove is the second listed community, located in western New Thassilon, and plays a major role in the Rusthenge adventure. The third community, Roderick's Cove, is a small town near Riddleport, which plays host to the ruins of a Hellstorm flume, and serves as the starting town in Return of the Runelords. The fourth community is Sandpoint, a town which, at this point, should need no introduction. Lastly, Turtleback Ferry is a small community near the Skulls Crossing Dam, which plays a major role in the Rise of the Runelords adventure path. If you are interested in using other small communities in the region, I might suggest Harse, Flameford, or the Callow Mounds from Curse of the Crimson Throne, or one of the many towns in the lands of the Lenorm Kings, like Southmoor or Yol. The Runelord researcher background really speaks to me personally, likely because it describes what I've been doing with this video series for the past 2 years. Your character has become fascinated by the history of Thassilon and the Runelords who ruled it. You've cultivated your understanding of Thassilonian history to the point that your expertise has aided in adventuring throughout Varissia, even drawing the eye of Queen Sorshan. You are trained in both Arcana, the most important skill in this AP, and Academia lore. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus on checks to recall knowledge about the Runelords or ancient Thassilon, and can automatically recognize basic information about any Runelord you see, either in person, via magic, or in artistic depictions, so long as that depiction is accurate. During your daily preparations, you choose one of the 7 schools of Sin from Thassilonian tradition. You gain a +1 status bonus on saving throws against effects related to that school of magic, described in detail in the text of the background. Finally, the Runelord Survivor background represents characters who have survived the previous attempts by the Runelords to return to power in the Age of Lost Omens. You might have survived an attack on Sandpoint by Karzug's stone giants or servants, or had part of your soul siphoned away by the cult of Lasala in Kermaga. Maybe you almost died in the Blood Veil Plague of Korvosa, or were almost drowned in the tsunami which struck Magnamar at the end of Shattered Star. Regardless of the specifics, you barely survived, and you were forced to learn a wide variety of skills to return to something like a stable life. You are trained in both nature and warfare lore. You gain the Hunt Runelord action as a special ability. Once per day, for one action, you designate one of the sins of ancient Thassilon. You then gain a +2 circumstance bonus on perception checks to seek a servant of that sin, as determined by the GM. You also gain a +2 circumstance bonus on intimidation checks to demoralize those targets, and deal an additional 1d4 damage with your strikes against those targets if they are already frightened. My party. Now, just like I've done in some previous Player's Guide videos, I want to close out this discussion on character creation with a sample party of 5 characters, which I would produce for this AP. These characters will lean into my own personal tastes and my strong desire for thematic connection to the AP material and interpersonal interaction. This is as much a mental exercise for me as a tool of inspiration for you, the audience. This party consists of 5 characters, all of whom are descended from humans native to the regions which make up the former territories of Thassilon. First up is Azendriath, an Ayuvaran descended from the native humans of Varisia and the elves of the Miarani forest. Azendriath is determined and calculating, and travels to Eurythnia upon the establishment of New Thassilon, so he might learn the arcane secrets of the Runelords to better protect his people. Mechanically, Azendriath is a wizard with the Runelord archetype, and he's chosen to focus on the sin of greed as a natural counter to Sorshan's school of lust. As a connection to his elven heritage, Azendriath has taken up the elven branch spear as his weapon of choice. He's also developed a fascination with runic tattoos and embedded Aeon stones as a means of amplifying his own innate power. With the Runelord researcher background, Azendriath is fascinated with the history of the Runelords and the powers they wielded, an obsession which is further reflected by his Runelord mythic calling. At the start of the campaign, Azendriath will become plagued by the lingering spirit of Runelord Naft, the first Runelord of Envy, as reflected by his avenging Runelord mythic destiny. Up next is Chelin, a human woman of apparent Thassilonian ethnicity who awoke recently in an ancient Thassilonian ruin during the Gods' reign. Chelin woke up atop a plinth in an otherwise empty room, her mind devoid of memories. She had the ability to speak, but only knew Thassilonian and Aslanti, and some archaic versions of Varisian, Shoanti, and Elvish. She emerged from the ruin after acquiring some old but well-preserved magic armor, plus a shield, and a scimitar which feels extremely comfortable in her hands. For those of you who've seen my SinMas videos, this backstory should be setting off alarm bells. Chelin is in fact the Chelin, the first champion of greed, the living woman transmuted from a golden statue. Though the magic animating her faded over time, and her consciousness transferred into the sword which bore her namesake, the statue remained, and was shuffled off into a temple in Shalast. The magic of the Gods' reign fell upon this statue and infused it with life, transforming her from inert gold to living flesh, restoring many of her skills and abilities, but failing to restore her sense of self or personality. Now she's made her way back to Xin-Eurythnia to discover the truth of her origins. Chelin is an exemplar, using the gleaming blade, mirrored aegis, and thousand-league sandals icons in battle. She has the escaped from time background, representing her consciousness's passage from the ancient past to the present. I decided on the time-racked mythic destiny, but I could easily see the war-shard warrior destiny fitting well too. Next, Anissa Aldergrave is a priestess of Nocticula. A human Nephilim of fiendish descent, Anissa spent years as a thief, con artist, and blackmailer, with little interest in religion. This changed in 4718, when the Nocticulan heretic Ayava healed Anissa from a serious injury in the slums of Magnamar. From there, she developed a fascination with the Redeemer Queen, and watched as Ayava's heretical beliefs were proven right. Following a small group of cultists in Magnamar, Anissa made her way to Xin-Eurythnia to find a place in the world with her new faith. On the way, she aided the citizens of Roderick's Cove with a local disaster, earning her their gratitude and taking the first steps on a journey of growth and self-improvement. Anissa is a cloistered cleric in Nocticulus service, and has turned over a new leaf as a spellcaster and healer. Her healer's calling reflects this focus on helping the injured. Her mythic destiny is the Mortal Herald, as she will work her way up in the service of her goddess, eventually earning a spot among the Redeemer Queen's most favored and even semi-divine servants. Rosalia Renici certainly stands out in the party. In her mid-60s, Madame Rosalia is certainly old for the adventuring life, particularly for a human. Her traditional Varisian lifestyle, however, has kept her active and energized. Among her own people, Rosalia is considered an elder, worthy of consideration and respect. She's an accomplished harrower, and specializes in the art of harrowing and fortune-telling more broadly. She passed these arts along to many of her family members, and, fun fact, she's actually the grandmother of a character I've built for Stolen Fate, who is herself a harrower witch. Rosalia is a devotee of the Open Road Pantheon, treating Desna as her patron deity within the Pantheon. She also reveres the Harrow, the mystical deck of cards connected to Varisian history. Her intimate knowledge of Varisian oral history has made Rosalia extremely cautious about the Runelords and their recent return. During the God's Reign, Rosalia was performing a reading to understand the events when she was suddenly struck by one of the falling war shards of Gorum. She and her cards became infused by the power of the shard, granting her the ability to wield the cards as weapons. This is where I would probably ask the GM to bend the rules a little bit and allow this character to take the Fane's Forberry Rogue feat as a level 2 class feat. It's not really power creep, and this ability is something I as a GM would allow. Rosalia is a thaumaturge, and uses her cards as both her weapon implement and her tome implement, reading the cards for information and infusing them with power so they might be thrown as weapons. With her Varisian history of traveling all across Avestan, she has the distant traveler background, and her history of fortune-telling ties into her Doomsayer mythic calling. Due to her connection with Gorum, she has the War Shard Warrior mythic destiny. The party is filled out by Krona Wolfrunner, a human from the Lyrune Kwa tribe of Shoanti peoples on the Storval Plateau. Growing up, she served as a scout, hunter, and warrior for the Lyrune Kwa tribe. She's a devout follower of their religious practices, which include a mix of animism, totem worship, and deity worship, with Desna standing out as especially prominent. She maintains an extremely broad skill set to support her people's itinerant lifestyle. These skills have served her well in recent years, as the rise of New Thassilon has disrupted life on the Storval Plateau. As a child, Krona's tribe was displaced by the activity on the Storval Plateau related to the Shattered Star and Year of the Risen Rune adventures. These challenges have hardened her heart against the Runelords, and she's become motivated to study them and oppose their further expansion. She distrusts everything related to New Thassilon, and fears the tales of the Runelords which linger in her people's oral history. Mechanically, Krona is an Avenger rogue, dedicated to the spiritual faith of the Lyrune Kwa. She wields star knives in combat, and specializes in acrobatic movements on the battlefield. Her Broken Chain mythic destiny represents her opposition to the tyranny of the Runelords. As a party, these 5 characters struggle with conflicting motivations, but are ultimately unified by the disasters they face. Azendrieth is the most driven and direct of the 5, putting him in a leadership role, notably a role he isn't really comfortable with in many cases. He's largely supported by Anissa, who is broadly supportive of Sorshan's regime, and who sees Azendrieth as a well-meaning, if cold, scholar, in need of empathetic counterbalancing. By contrast, Krona often bucks against Azendrieth's leadership, believing him to be vulnerable to the corruption of the Runelords. She would be more than willing to see Sorshan's project torn down, but is forced to admit that she and Azendrieth are far from the biggest threat to her people. Madame Rosalia, meanwhile, often acts as the voice of reason in the group, calming tempers and offering words of wisdom with double meanings, to cause reflection and careful thought among her allies. She's also the voice of the party when dealing with outsiders, and is the best diplomat among the group. Finally, Chelin is largely stoic and passive, but as she discovers more about her history, she will grow increasingly cautious about rune magic, which will be in tension with her increasing friendship with Azendrieth and the rest of the party. She's the frontline bruiser in the party, defending them and providing flanking for Krona's sneak attacks. So, that's my proposed party for Revenge of the Runelords. But man, there are so many potential plot points you could play with in Thassilonian history to make rich and interesting characters for this campaign. So, anyway, here's the second party I cooked up for Revenge of the Runelords, because I have no self-control and couldn't rein in my imagination. This next party consists of 5 characters: a brother-sister pair of humans from the land of the Lenorm Kings, a Kolo from broader Avestan, a serpentine humanoid from Xin-Eurythnia, and a mechanical clockwork from New Thassilon. Up first is Ylvar Grírsdóttir, a human Nephilim with the battle-blooded lineage, whose divine bloodline was awoken during the God's reign. Ylvar was a devout worshipper of Gorum, and was one of his battle priestesses, until the God's reign shook her faith to its core, when the Lord in Iron was brought low. She had been a sorcerer prior to the God's reign, so her powers weren't lost when her god died. Her faith was shattered, however, and the infusion of power which filled her when she was struck by her god's blood did nothing to clarify her purpose. She didn't achieve this sense of purpose until recently, when she and her brother Vrent defended the town of Osprey Cove from an assault by rogue agents of Runelord Belimarius. During this conflict, Ylvar reconnected to her belief in the importance of battle, not simply as a tool of destruction, but as a tool of protection and community defense as well. Her new worldview, one which sees war as an unfortunate necessity in a violent world, will drive her to embrace the spark of divinity within her as she advances in her godling mythic destiny, working toward becoming a new community-minded goddess of war. Ylvar is an Aesir bloodline sorcerer who uses her spells in combat to support her martial brother, Vrent. Speaking of, Vrent Olagsson is a simple man at first glance. Tall and broad, Vrent is a fighter who fearlessly wades into combat with his bearded great axe and heavy armor. Like his sister Ylvar, Vrent's faith in his god Gorum was shattered during the god's reign, but he buried his uncertainties deep down, so he might be Ylvar's rock, while she mentally and emotionally recovered. During their travels, Vrent and Ylvar were caught up in a brief war between Runelord Belimarius and Opir Eightfingers. During this battle, Vrent witnessed a flash of divine power in his sister, and became convinced in his religious desperation that she was Gorum's designated successor. He's tried and failed to talk himself out of this conviction, and as he's heard Ylvar's ruminations on the nature of war as a tool of protection, his secret belief has become even stronger. This is another instance where I would try to bend the official rules slightly. I like the idea of Vrent and Ylvar remaining tied together mechanically, so I would want him to be her mortal herald as she accepts her new divinity. I would need to get GM approval to make this work, but I think it makes for some fun narrative opportunities. Vrent has the Runelord survivor background and the Guardian's mythic calling. In combat, he serves as a direct damage dealer and tank, amplifying his physical strength with Ylvar's divine spells. Up next, Unbowed Tree is a Kolo from northern Garund, descended from the ancient Kolo who served in Haruka under the Slavers of Sloth. Unbowed Tree is fascinated by the lost history of her people, and the recent return of the Runelords has presented her with an opportunity to discover more about the culture which had shaped the lives of her distant ancestors. Per the teachings and customs of her people, she has trained her mind and body to resist magic, and she's doubled down on her opposition to the arcane as she has traveled to Xin-Eurythnia. While not openly hostile to Sorshan or her followers, Unbowed Tree is cautious and hesitant to accept the new queen's authority and apparent benevolence without question. Mechanically, she is a superstition instinct barbarian, and she employs her jaws and arms in equal measure to grapple and restrain her opponents. Her power will be further increased as she develops her immortal legend mythic destiny. Up next, Ketra is kind of an odd character to describe, so let me back up a bit and talk about her backstory. When Xandergul created the Sword of Pride, he summoned and seduced Baraket, an Azada princess from Elysium, to be the sword's bearer. She died years later, and her consciousness transferred into the blade itself. This is where I start making stuff up. Ketra is the result of an attempt by the Runelords of Envy to secretly clone Baraket's mortal form in an attempt to create a loyal servant who could steal and wield the Sword of Pride. She was born under the reign of Belimarius, but became trapped in Xin-Eurythnia when Belimarius created the crystalline. Mechanically, Berekhet is a noble Nagaji, with origins as a celestial Nephilim. This is my mechanical answer to how you create an Azada as a playable character. Ketra is a bard, a talented spellcaster with an affection for all forms of music. Well aware of her origins as an attempted clone of Princess Berekhet, Ketra has dedicated herself to the study of the Runelords. She harbors a deep grudge against Belimarius, who sees her as a wayward experiment which has escaped containment. As Ketra grows in power, she will ascend to the full power of an Azada, as represented by her ascended celestial mythic destiny. The final member of this party is Cogs, a humanoid Thassilonian clockwork construct awoken by the strange magic of the recent God's reign. Cogs was woken up in a collection of clockwork experiments gathered in Magnamar. Since his awakening, he's begun to augment his clockwork body and improve upon its design. He remains fascinated with the idea of his place in the world as a new type of being, and has sought out New Thassilon as a place he might belong. Mechanically, Cogs is an automaton, reflavored as a Thassilonian clockwork. He's an inventor with the armor innovation, with his armor flavored as augmentations to his own body. He uses his eye beam and claws in combat. Since he awoke, Cogs has been experiencing strange dreams and visions of his creation during the days of ancient Thassilon, implying that he might have some mysterious connection to the dimensions of either dreams or time. Cogs has the Dreamer mythic calling, and the Time-Racked mythic destiny. Within this party of 5 oddballs and misfits, the force of Ylvar's personality is the dominant driving factor. She's the most openly friendly member of the group, and her bravery and dedication inspires friendship in others. Vrent follows Ylvar unquestioningly, but he struggles to understand his relationship with the woman who was once his sister and who is on her way to becoming a deity. He takes comfort in his fast friendship with Unbowed Tree, whose down-to-earth worldview helps to ground the party in such a crazy world. Berekhet and Cogs, meanwhile, both serve as the intellectual experts in the party, with Berekhet specializing in social and historical intelligence, and Cogs specializing in academic, arcane, and technical intelligence. Berekhet starts out wary of Ylvar's leadership, fearing the potential for a leader unworthy of loyalty, but she warms up over time. Cogs, by contrast, is eager to make a group of friends with whom he feels a connection and a sense of belonging. And hey, I'm kind of a huge Thassilonian lore nerd, so why not make one more party for shiggles? I realize this is probably getting a little tedious for some of you, but screw it. This is my video and I'm having fun. So I'm going to keep going, and if you get bored, feel free to skip ahead to the GM advice section, or the outro if you want to remain spoiler-free. This third, and I promise final, party consists of 5 characters: a Dromar human from Korvosa, 2 Thassilonian humans from Xin-Eurythnia, a flesh warp from a lab in Varissia, and a dragon-blooded elf from the Miarani forest. Up first, Alana Quinn is a human Dromar who was born and raised in Korvosa. As a young woman, she was kidnapped for forced recruitment by Queen Iliosa's Grey Maidens. She joined in with Oriana's band and became one of the Grey Maidens ensnared by the demon Ashamintalu within the Lady's Light. Only after this did Alana's conditioning begin to crack, a process which only recently completed, as she found faith in Nocticula, the Redeemer Queen. Alana is now seeking redemption for her past misdeeds, particularly by hunting down and defeating the evils of ancient and powerful magic. Alana is a thaumaturge, who uses her shield implement to defend herself and her allies from spells, and her sword implement to attack and punish spellcasters who get too close. She utilizes her scroll esoterica to amplify her combat abilities. Her Broken Chain mythic destiny represents her opposition to domination by powerful archmages, a quest which is deeply personal due to her past experiences. Her Runelord researcher background represents the research she has done on the Runelords to better understand the Archwizards, which she perceives as the greatest potential threat to the peoples of Varissia. Supporting Alana are the twins Vrasis and Vrex. The twins Vrasis and Vrex were born in Xin-Eurythnia under the reign of Runelord Belimarius. Both were brought up in the faith of Lasala, the Sihedron Scion, and as young teens were handed over to the church for special training. Vrasis was trained as a temple guard, mixing martial skill with magic to defend sacred sites and traveling pilgrims. Vrex was trained as a priestess and spellcaster, becoming a rune witch. They grew up under the Church's care and were accomplished servants of the faith when they became trapped in the time loop of the crystalline. When they emerged into the Age of Lost Omens, they found a world which their goddess had abandoned. Vrasis found himself adrift without his goddess, and struggled in the years since his return to find a place for himself in the world. He has relied on Vrex's relative strength and assuredness, and has followed her lead. The intense discipline of his training is now coming into direct conflict with a world where his goddess's ordered teachings no longer hold sway or power, and he's begun to struggle with indulgence and a short temper as a result. This will eventually be further amplified by his avenging Runelord mythic destiny, when a shadow of Xirin, third Runelord of Wrath, will attach itself to his soul. Mechanically, Vrasis is a magus, with the inexorable iron hybrid study. Like many Thassilonians, Vrasis trained in the use of polearms, and in his case, the Fauchard. Vrex, by contrast, was quick to adjust to Lissala's absence. She initially panicked when her magic failed to function, since Lissala herself had been Vrex's patron. But, by some minor miracle, she managed to find a new source, something internal, to power her magic. Unsure of how to interpret this new development, Vrex decided that she needed to mask her insecurity for the sake of her brother. Mechanically, Vrex is a witch, with the Seneschal class archetype. She's become her own patron, and will slowly cultivate this power within herself as she grows in power. This new internal power source will eventually manifest for others, as she progresses toward her wild spell mythic destiny. Her devotion to Lissala has lapsed, replaced with a curiosity about her deity's fate, and the nature of the new magic within her. Azure the Tall cuts a strange figure. A flesh warp infused with a connection to the elements of air and water, Azure covers his towering, many-armed frame in a flowing, dark cloak. Azure was born, so to speak, in the bowels of Hollow Mountain, in the years between Alasnist's emergence and the events of Return of the Runelords. He emerged from a Fleshforge lab, a lingering experiment from the ancient days. With the return of Thassilon, a number of such creations, clockworks, fleshwarps, giants, people out of time, have begun to emerge. Searching for a place in the world, Azure, who named himself for his distinctive blue skin, saved a small settlement on the shores of Rivendrake Isle from an attack by Belimarius' scouts. This provided him inspiration. He would reclaim Hollow Mountain and establish a land for the remnants of Thassilon. Unlike Eurythnia, this new place would not be under the thumb of a former Runelord. It would be ruled democratically, with no place for powerful rulers. Mechanically, Azure is a kineticist, with connections to both water and wind. As an editorial note, I would really like a clarification from Paizo on how kinetic blasts and talents are supposed to interact with the mythic system. As a short-form house rule, I suggest simply ruling 1-action blasts as strikes, 2-action impulses as cantrips, and anything more complicated than that as a spell. It's not perfect, but it's quick and easy. Azure has the prophesied monarch mythic destiny, as he attempts to found his new nation for beings like himself, who want independence from archmages but acceptance in their community. His gentle heart and tendency toward caring for others are reflected in his caretaker's calling. Last up, this party is rounded out by Valdion, a dragonblood elf descended from the Mierani elves of Avestan. Valdion bears a special connection to the omen dragons of Galarian, and this connection has led him to the faith of Apsu, the father of the draconic pantheon. This connection to the esoteric omen dragons has gifted him with a sixth sense for magical or spiritual activities, which fed into him developing his animistic powers. Valdion has the Runelord survivor background, having been driven from his home in the Mierani forest by the recent machinations of Runelord Belimarius. His connection to omen dragons has given him visions of tragedies, leading to his doomsayer mythic calling. I'm not in love with any of the mythic destinies for this character, but I think Mortal Herald is likely the best fit, leaning into the anti-tyranny aspect of Apsu's faith, and taking advantage of the new lore from Draconic Codex, which states that Apsu is taking a much more active role in the fate of Galarian since the God's reign. Within this party, Alana is the undisputed leader, as she is the most driven. Her fundamental need to help people and work for the good of the innocent inspires her allies to greatness. Azure largely matches Alana's hopeful attitude, though his lack of past sins gives him a different perspective. He acts as a support member and healer for the party. Vrex, meanwhile, contrasts Alana and Azure as a cynic and a pessimist. She is determined to help her allies, but confronts the world by expecting the worst and relying on nothing but herself and her brother. Vrasis, meanwhile, follows Vrex unquestioningly, searching for purpose, and slowly starting to find it in his burgeoning friendships. He serves as the party's frontliner, fighting back-to-back with Alana. Valdion works as a backline support caster, remaining close to Vrex to benefit from her magical aura. Where Vrex takes on an analytical and logical role in the party, Valdion's knowledge is more esoteric and fluid. Their differing perspectives benefit the group, but cause them to butt heads. Alright, that, finally, brings my proposed party section to an end. To those of you who bore with me through all of that self-indulgence, thank you. I hope I didn't bore you. GM Advice, or How Might I Run This? Warning, the following section is intended for GMs only. If you are planning to play in this adventure path, I suggest stopping this video now. I'll need to discuss some spoilers to properly address my suggested adjustments to this adventure. You've been warned. Alright, well, if you've seen the timestamp for this video, you've probably guessed that I have a lot to say about this AP. I am a huge Thassilon nerd, and I have a lot I would want to do to make this campaign as good as it could possibly be. That's not to say that the campaign as written isn't good or isn't fun. It definitely can be, even with no changes or only minor changes. That said, the text of the AP openly encourages GMs to add to and modify the campaign. Revenge is built upon a huge history of Thassilonian lore and player-facing AP-based history, so there are plenty of opportunities to implement changes to call back to the events, enemies, and plot points which have resonated with your players in previous campaigns. On top of that, if your group doesn't love subsystems, there's plenty of ways to modify those and flesh them out. So, with all that said, I've organized my GM recommendations into 3 distinct sections: changes you could make without making significant structural rewrites, updates to customize the individual risen Runelords, and larger changes, which will fundamentally alter the structure of the campaign. Most of the small changes can be implemented in any number of combinations, but if you make some of the larger changes, you might preclude yourself from doing some of the smaller ones. That'll make sense once we start discussing the larger changes in more detail. Also, please note that this section assumes you've seen all of my SinMas content, and are fairly familiar with it. I've got a lot to say here, and if I backtrack to explain every little detail, I'll be here all day. Again, you don't have to make any of these changes to have fun in this AP. It's perfectly fine on its own. This is just a wish list for how I would make it even better. Some of what I'm discussing would be pretty easy to work with, while other suggestions are extremely involved. Okay, enough prelude. Let's get going. Part 1. Minor non-structural changes. Let's start the small changes off with some alterations to Book 1. Book 1 is definitely the weakest of the 3, so if you're going to make changes anywhere, I strongly suggest making them here. When the PCs first meet with Sortion in Book 1, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me that they need to convince her that the Trinity Star cultists are a serious threat. Sortion is the most powerful enchanter in the world. She can just use a spell to determine if the heroes are being truthful, or potentially even read their minds and experience the events with Runelord Gimel herself. I do like the idea of having a social challenge here, however, so I propose a fairly simple change. Convincing Sortion of the validity of the threat is a test. Sortion believes in the threat almost immediately, and she is instead testing the PCs to determine if they are worthy to serve her as her personal trusted agents. Sortion has a history of similar behavior with adventurers, going back to Return of the Runelords, so this change is very much in character, while not undermining her extraordinary arcane power. Next up, the celebration leading up to the portal ceremony needs some serious rework. This celebration contains a series of non-combat challenges for the PCs to overcome, as they interact with the crowd and work security. The events as written aren't necessarily bad on their own, but they fail to contribute to the narrative in a meaningful way, making them feel like wasted page space. First, the Constructs Amok event is kind of fun, but needs to have at least one potential combat encounter, since this book is way too light on combat. Also, you as a GM should tie this to Toth Breacher, the clockwork researcher in Magnamar in Book 2 of this AP. The researcher in this event could be a close friend or apprentice to Toth, connecting Book 1 to Book 2 in a small way. For the Thesis Argument event, I like what they're going for, I really do, but it feels a little underbaked. This is already tied to the new Runelords student faction in the city. As much as I might complain about the dependency on subsystems sometimes, this event is an opportunity for the author to implement and expand upon those rules. Lastly, the uninvited viewing event really annoys me, because it takes up way too much page space, but doesn't introduce any characters relevant to the narrative. I would either cut this and replace it with something related to the Giant or Merchant factions, or I would update it to involve the Church of Nocticula, rather than a complete rando that your players will never see again. The Nocticulan Church is underused in this book, so adding them here could be a nice way to make them feel important. Okay, now I'm jumping ahead to the introduction of the faction leaders, after the disaster at the portal ceremony. As Xin-Eurythnia is collapsing, the PCs need to convince the leaders of the various factions in the city to support their effort to lead the citizens to safety in a mass exodus. Not a bad idea, in theory. The issue I have is that it feels too easy. These faction leaders are not mentioned anywhere until this social encounter, and they play almost no role hereafter. At the same time, Ayava, the leader of the Nocticulan Church, isn't considered a faction leader, even though the church is probably the single most powerful political body in the city. So the first thing I would change is have Ayava be the quest giver, and have her lead the party to each of the faction leaders separately. Then you add 3 short side quests, one for each leader. Some are combat, some are non-combat. They don't need to be long, but they need to relate to the faction in question. Rescuing arcane texts from a collapsing library, helping giants gather food for the journey south, or helping merchants secure their goods in storage locations, which will preserve them until they can return later. If you still want a social encounter with all 3 leaders after that, I think it's still fine to leave it in. Then we come to the Exodus itself. Again, this is a great idea in theory. An exodus of civilians is a fantastic event for a mythic campaign, and draws to mind the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt. The issue is in the execution. The Exodus itself makes use of one of the victory point subsystems, in this case an infiltration, which isn't bad for a framework. The problem is that there are no events built into the system to break it up, or to give the players a more personal connection with the people they are saving. The whole Exodus, which is supposed to take place over 10 days, could easily be run over a single long session, running all 10 challenges in quick succession, and wrapping up with the final combat. At the end, the players tally up their points, and use those to determine the number of civilians they lost along the way. And wow, is that boring and disappointing. As written, the PCs have no connection to the people they're trying to save, and the number of civilians is so high as to become abstract. To fix this issue, and to make the whole Exodus feel like a long-term challenge without bogging down the whole AP, I suggest adding a unique encounter at the end of each adventuring day. Some of these could be relatively simple combat encounters. There are, after all, plenty of predators which might seek to prey upon the fleeing citizens, including drake flocks, yetis, or even a wendigo with the weak template, which might serve as a cool callback to Rise of the Runelords. Each of these combat challenges should have the wrinkle of needing to defend the civilians, but the heroes could also gain the support of the faction leaders, or Ayava. Outside of combat encounters, I would also add some non-combat encounters, relating to the needs of each faction. Help Ayava organize other religious leaders to boost morale. Help convince the giants not to wander off on their own and leave the small folk behind. Or settle an internal conflict among the magical scholars. On top of that, there is one key factor which absolutely should provide a narrative challenge: Leng. Historically, Xin-Shalast was blanketed by a shroud of eldritch energy from the nightmare realm of Leng. Sorshan is probably in the process of tearing this down, but the book makes no mention of it. I would create some kind of haunt, or recurring nightmare, which affects the entire Exodus until the heroes work out some means of protection, or get to the headwaters of the river Ava at the Fen of the Ice Mists. Again, the goal of these individual challenges is to connect the heroes to the people following them. As the heroes succeed or fail at these challenges, their accumulated victory points could be affected further, improving or worsening the results of the Exodus while adding narrative weight. Now that we've discussed the Exodus itself, we jump to Chapter 3 of Book 1, and I don't really think we need to change much here. Chapter 3 is pretty solid all the way through, and I would only make a few minor changes. First up, as the heroes are exploring the ruins of Xin-Eurythnia, I would add some cutscenes as the players follow Xandergul's echo. These don't need to be long, but I like the idea of the heroes experiencing some lingering temporal anomalies from the days of Return of the Runelords. These could grant the heroes a glimpse of Alasnist making her way towards Xandergul's palace, or researching the Scepter of Ages. I especially like the idea of the Echo witnessing these as well, and stopping to watch them, with the PCs getting to experience the Echo's rage and embarrassment as they stand in the same place. This has the added benefit of foreshadowing Alasnist as the final risen Runelord in Book 3. More importantly, in Chapter 3, I suggest modifying the final boss fight of the Eye of Arrogance. Runelords Angothane and Thibidos are cool, but if your players never played Return of the Runelords, and never watched my 12 Days of SinMas, they will have no idea who these people are. To fix this, I suggest using the unique time-altering power of the Runewells to give the players a brief glimpse of what Thibidos and Angothane were doing before the heroes arrived. These two characters should absolutely hate one another, with Thibidos thinking Angothane is a worthless idiot, and Angothane countering by mocking Thibidos' fate at Alasnist's hands. The fight itself is fine, but I like the idea of the Runelords being able to exploit some esoteric connection between Xandergul's throne and the statues in the room, to allow them to cast their spells from those statues instead of their own location. More on that in a bit. That concludes Book 1, so now let's dig into the non-structural changes I suggest for Book 2. Right off the bat, Book 2 makes heavy repeated use of the research system, which makes a lot of sense. APs involving Thassilon have long been tied to the idea of research in hidden arcane libraries, so this is a natural evolution of that theme. The problem I have is that the PCs in this adventure completely ignore the Thoracic Library, the incredible cache of Thassilonian lore discovered back in Rise of the Runelords. This is a huge missed opportunity for a callback, but it also doesn't make a ton of sense in universe. So how would I fix this? I like the idea of the PCs starting by reaching out to the Sihedron Council, led by Sheila Hydemarch. This is the natural place to start, and could even allow the heroes to talk to the PCs of previous adventures, since they are in contact with the Council. This council meeting could remain a social encounter, but you could just as easily turn it into a roleplay-only event. I would alter this meeting with the Council by having the Council conduct a specialized ritual to have Toph Ornelos of the Academy and Elias Tamerhawk of the Cipher Mages basically Zoom call in. The Council should then send the heroes to the Thoracic Library, asking them to pick up the researcher Planchara Ebengrave at the Academy along the way. If there are questions about what the PCs of previous campaigns are doing, you can easily hand-wave it away by explaining that those PCs are researching at other locations, like the Runeforge, the Academy, the Cipher Mage libraries, or the Thoracic Spire in Kermaga. Once the heroes arrive at the Thoracic Library, then the research can all be performed there. We, the community, already have a map for this area from Return of the Runelords, so that's easy to retool. Of the listed research opportunities in the book, I especially like the Clockwork Whale encounter with Toth Breacher, and the Cardosian Fragments encounter with Planchara Ebengrave. To accommodate the whale encounter, just adjust the story slightly to briefly explain that Toth had the Clockwork Whale moved to the library at great expense to safely conduct experiments upon it. Because this first section of the campaign can seem a little combat light, you might consider adding a larger combat encounter with the beached Clockwork Whale, or a combat encounter with some lingering necromantic shade as a consequence for failed research checks. Then we come to the Tarnished Temple, and honestly I quite like this section. The Kraken boss fight feels suitably epic or mythical, and the dungeon is a nice mix of combat and hazards. The only thing you might consider adding, if your players played Shattered Star, could be to add a combat encounter with one of the Veiled Masters, who led Xin down the path of rune magic. Up next is the encounter with the three generals, Lograssi, Roaring Storm, and Knud Halmarsson. My issue here is that this is simultaneously too deep and not deep enough. Looking at the three generals, only one is relevant at a later point in the story. Roaring Storm represents the Nolanders, criminals and outcasts who've carved an existence for themselves free of outside rulership, And Knud Halmarsson, great first name by the way, represents the horse lords of the Valashu Uplands, a subset of Ulfin peoples of the lands of the Lenorm kings. Neither of these two characters comes up again in the story outside of the Doomsday Door sequence later on, which, trust me, I will get to. The third general is Lograci, a servant of Belimarius who has ties to the earlier Shades of Blood adventure path. Lograci is kind of important to the story later on in Book 3. The social encounter, as written, doesn't do enough to give Lograci a memorable character, but also makes Roaring Storm and Knud too interesting to simply drop them out of the narrative entirely. So how do I suggest fixing this? First, we need to start this encounter off when the PCs first arrive by foreshadowing Belimarius. She shows up in Book 3 without much fanfare, so let's give her an introduction here. To do this, I suggest allowing Belimarius access to the ritual which Alasnist used to burn the city of Akratos back in the days of ancient Aslant. This would allow her to project her face and voice above the pitched battlefield. As the heroes arrive, Belimarius should project herself over the gathered forces and order her generals to attack and slaughter her enemies. This foreshadows Belimarius and should emphasize her entitlement and impatience. Next, this might sound strange, but I suggest eliminating Lograci and replacing him with Captain Joshel, Belimarius' champion and the wielder of the Sword of Envy. Joshel has already been introduced in previous publications, meaning anyone who's played Return of the Runelords will recognize him. This also has the added benefit of introducing one of the Swords of Sin into the campaign, artifacts which are oddly missing in the baseline AP. Joshel is also interesting for being a half-elf, putting an immense chip on his shoulder in the deeply racist society of ancient Thassilon. Belimarius long ago promised to transform Joshel into a full-blooded human, but never made good on this promise. This gives us fruitful ground to create internal conflict in Joshel between his loyalty to Belimarius and his loyalty to his men. He doesn't want his men to die, and senses that pushing the Nolanders and the Horse Lords too aggressively might cause them to unify. After Belimarius' appearance in the sky, the heroes should be noticed and approached by one of Joshel's scouts, who invites them to his camp. Arriving at the camp, they are received by Joshel, who informs them that he wants to retreat to save his men. He goes so far as to explain his concerns about unified enemies, and the dangers of Belimarius' aggressive expansion. He then assigns the heroes to interact with the other generals to learn about them. The heroes then go to the other two camps and learn about the other generals and their concerns, earning their trust as impartial outsiders. This then concludes with a modified version of the printed social encounter, where the PCs now have the goal of convincing Roaring Storm and Knud to present a unified front against Joshel to provide him with the excuse needed to retreat. The only way I would keep Lograci in this AP is if your group has already played Shades of Blood, since he ties back to a plot point in that campaign. Moving on, the Trial of Runes is great and fun, and I wouldn't really change it. The Emerald Chambers, however, could use just a little work. I'm disappointed that we didn't get to explore the Emerald Chambers themselves, since they are an absolutely insane dungeon on their own. My biggest issue, however, is Xin-Eurythnia, the bodyguard of Xin who leads the Silent Devotees. Where is he? Xin-Eurythnia should be here somewhere. He absolutely hates the Runelords, so there's potential for him to be far more than a simple boss fight. My initial thought is, what if Xandergul ensnared Xin-Eurythnia with a series of complex illusions? Then the former bodyguard could serve as a joint boss with Karzug at the end of the dungeon. This runs the risk of making the final boss fight too hard, but if the heroes manage to break through Xandergul's illusions, then Xin-Eurythnia could join them in killing Karzug. Mechanically, Xin-Eurythnia is a non-spellcaster and a Grave Knight, most known for his magical shield. Technically, this shield was stolen in the official lore, but just hand-wave that away and give him his shield. I suggest giving the shield ability similar to the shield implement from the Thaumaturge, to make it feel special and powerful. Looking at the Crypt of Runes itself, I generally like this dungeon. The author did an admirable job of mixing traps, hazards, combat, and social encounters together into a fun and memorable experience. If you did want to add some more flavor, you could look back at the sin-themed wings of the Runeforge from Rise of the Runelords and lift some of the more thematic traps, encounters, or atmospheric items from that dungeon. I'm thinking of the connection to the void from the Ravenous Crypts of Gluttony, or the hero copying mirrors from the Shimmering Halls of Pride. Alternatively, there are a ton of fun Sin-themed dungeons scattered throughout Varisia, so you could easily pull in specific callbacks relevant to your players, based on which adventures and campaigns they've played in the past. Now we come to Chapter 3, and hoo boy do I have issues with this chapter, and specifically the first 2 pages. At the risk of sounding a little bit dramatic, why in Gorham's name do we seal 6 Doomsday Doors over the course of 2 pages within the context of the chase rules? This is the single most underwhelming way to address such a cataclysmic threat. For reference, back in Shattered Star, closing even a single Doomsday Door took an entire adventure module. Here, each star can be closed in the space of about 3 short paragraphs. Now, pragmatically, I get it. The adventure outline from Paizo clearly required the closing of 6 Doomsday Doors as part of the plot, and there simply isn't enough page space to detail them out as full encounters. In that case, they should have just been cut, or the number should have been reduced to 1, which could have been filled out as a meaningful encounter, with the others resolved off-screen by the Sihedron Council and their allies. But I have the luxury of not giving a shit about page count, as anyone who's watched my content can attest. So let's see if we can do better. First things first, talk to your players and see if they are even remotely interested in playing through 6 vaguely similar sets of challenges in quick succession. For some groups, this is a non-starter, and in that case, I suggest performing one of these challenges, then letting the Sihedron Council resolve the others off-screen, with the involvement of the heroes of previous APs, the PFS, and the powerful NPCs the heroes have met on their journey so far. If you do choose to go about running all 6 of these, you then have a decision to make. Do your players face all 6 of these themselves, or do you give the players the opportunity to embody other characters? If you happen to be a gaming group who have played through a number of the previous Runelords products before, it might be fun to rebuild the characters from those previous campaigns in the 2e rules, then bring them back for the Doomsday Door dungeon most relevant to their story. For instance, the heroes of Curse of the Crimson Throne, or the new Shadows at Sundown adventure, could address the door beneath Korvosa. The PFS agents from the Year of the Risen Rune could work great for Sechnevali, since it is right in their backyard. The Shattered Star PCs could definitely be the ones to head for Windsong Abbey, and the Return of the Runelords PCs could definitely head for Old Zinadaceril. That leaves Yol for the heroes of Rise of the Runelords, which isn't a great fit, but it could work fine. And finally, the Sleeper, the mountain which hides the ruin of Zingastash, could be handled by Count Varian Jaeger and his companions. Alternatively, the Orcs of Belkzen might send the heroes of Triumph of the Tusk to aid the Sihedron Council at the Sleeper, due to the alliance between Sorshan and Ardax the Whitehair. Or some of the heroes' NPC allies might take up this mission, including Jathariel 5 runes, Ayava, the giant leader Voshkar, Roaring Storm, Knud Halmarsson, or any number of others. Now, what about the encounters themselves? For each of these Doomsday Door challenges, I suggest creating a mini dungeon consisting of about 5 rooms, containing 3 combat encounters and 1 hazard, haunt, or trap. Some of these dungeons, like Sechnevali or Windsong Abbey, already have maps you could use scattered across previous Paizo publications. Others you will need to make up, or need to steal from other sources, then reflavor as the appropriate maps. As far as building these encounters goes, Paizo has provided us with a nice hook. We know which Risen Runelord is leading the Trinity Star cultists around each door, and some vague details about the forces they are working with. I have a section later in this video on how to customize each of the Risen Runelords, so I suggest tying all that information together to create sets of encounters which feel authentic to those Runelords and that location. In the Customized Runelords section, when I discuss the 6 Risen Runelords leading those teams, I will add information on what troops they should be working with. Getting back to the narrative itself, after the Doomsday Door sequence, we jump back to the research subsystem, discovering that Xandergul is using the Risen Runelords and Aethusa as his soul cages, allowing him to become functionally immortal. Just like the last research sequence, I suggest basing this at the Thoracic Library, working alongside the same group of researchers the PCs gathered earlier in the story. Maybe even throw in some of the academics among the groups of past PCs who helped in the Doomsday Door sequence. Then we head to the Dimension of Dreams. I don't really have any problem hand-waving the travel to that dimension, but if your friend group has played through Shattered Star, I suggest sending the PCs to Guilt Spur, where they can use the magic of the Dreaming Tower fragment within to aid their interdimensional travel. Within the Dimension of Dreams, I generally like this sequence, but I think you could add some additional combat by having Liralaru attempt to reach out to the PCs as soon as they arrive. Her communications are interrupted until after the Aethusa fight, but they do draw the attention of some denizens of Leng, who follow her psychic message to the PCs and haunt Dream Cyrusian. As the PCs defeat these nightmarish threats, they gain the trust of the villagers and Simon Cradle. After that, the rest of the adventure can play out largely as written. I don't have any other meaningful issues with the rest of Book 2, and I actually like the atmosphere of the final dungeon in Leng. The maps are a little bit boring, but that's fine. Now we can move on to Book 3. A lot of stuff in Book 3 works really well, but we can definitely make a few minor tweaks to make things really shine. Right off the bat, when we meet with the Eurythnian generals and the dragon Galisodia in Vecker's Crossing, we need to include the 3 faction leaders from Book 1, the Rune Giant leader Voshkar, the Lamia matriarch Sonrasi, and the Runelord scholar Jithariel 5 runes. These 3 can provide input on the city and their unique perspectives on it, and can tie the following missions to their areas of expertise. This small addition ties Books 1 and 3 together. At the same time, the council meeting allows us to bring back Roaring Storm and Knut Halmarsson from Book 2. They should be assigned, via magical communication, to launch a unified attack on Xin-Eurythnia, while Belimarius and her forces are distracted in Xin-Eurythnia. The battle can occur off-screen, but giving these characters something to do makes the whole AP feel more unified and cohesive. The missions which the PCs undertake in the city are fine, if a bit short, but it might be fun to tie them back to the side quests which we invented for the faction leaders, back before the Exodus, assuming you made that change. When it comes to closing the Doomsday Door at the base of the city, I think we need to spice it up just a little bit. Each challenge in this sequence should be followed by a brief combat encounter. I want this sequence to feel grueling, so we need to make it more difficult with a series of monsters connected to Jondelay, or at least infused with Jondelay's apocalyptic energies. Fair warning, however, adding combat here will make the combat encounter with the Ancient One at the end substantially more challenging. Now we come to the Blood Moon Palace, and this is where we reap the benefits of having planted the seed of Captain Joshel back in Book 2. By replacing Lograssi with Captain Joshel and having the PCs work directly with him during the 3 generals encounter, it's far more suitable for the narrative to offer a non-combat pathway to gain access to the Rune Well of Lust. At this point, the heroes can play out the social encounter with only a minor adjustment to hide Joshel's desire to walk away from Belimarius. Also, in this encounter, the book seems a little confused about the Sin-Spawn general Nonumaliana. The book describes her as a human woman, but also as a Sin-Spawn, then describes her as wanting to take up the mantle of Runelord of Envy once Belimarius is defeated. If the character is a Sin-Spawn, she doesn't look like a human, and cannot ascend to the title of Runelord since she's not a spellcaster. She might want to usurp Belimarius, but wouldn't really be able to take up the title of Runelord. I suggest keeping her as a Sin-Spawn, then just fixing the description to clarify that she doesn't look human. It's a minor editing mistake, really, but it bugged me. Now we come to the fight with Belimarius, and I like this. I don't think we need to make any changes to the fight itself, but we need to add a pair of cutscenes to add more atmosphere. At the start, Belimarius needs a speech to add to her character. Maybe have her knock over the statue of Sortian during the speech. At the conclusion of the fight, we add a small scene to get a glimpse of Runelord Sortian, like we had back at the Sunken Temple in Book 2. She has a connection to the Rune Well of Lust, so I think she could easily send one final message to the heroes here. Now we enter the Blood Moon Palace Archives, in Chapter 2, the section which I like to call Where Was the Editor? As written, we spend 12 pages in a dungeon with only a few hazards and one simple combat encounter. The information we learn here is great, and we gain access to copies of the Sinuous Gisarm and the Scintillating Garment, which is fantastic, but man, this is an incredibly inefficient way to write an adventure. Do not run this as a dungeon crawl. It will take way longer than it needs to. This is a great opportunity for the victory point system, or to simply expand on the existing research subsystem entry by adding new achievements to gain access to those legendary artifacts alongside all the relevant information and useful items in Sortian's collection. Also, add in Ashaya, the Sword of Lust, as a findable artifact. We, as a community, have never encountered it in an official AP, so this is the place to put it. If you do want to run these archives as a dungeon crawl, you need to add more combat, and help clarify which treasures the PCs are allowed to take. Maybe use the cat Astalure to help the PCs understand what treasures they can keep. Also, I have some advice for making it a dungeon crawl in the bigger adjustments section later in the video. One minor adjustment I would make to the research is to have both Aethusa and Liralaru aid in the research. Both these characters are important in Books 1 and 2, but neither of them make significant appearances in Book 3. Adding them here to aid in the research gives them something to do. Aethusa should be able to provide insight into Xandergul's plans, while Liralaru can steer the PCs toward the right research topics via dream communications. The book, as written, claims that the research could take weeks, but I like the idea of keeping the time sensitivity in place. Including these two NPCs could easily help speed things along. Beyond that, you could even pull in the PCs from previous APs at your table, or the research companions from the Thoracic Library. Moving to the Spindlehorn sequence, I love everything about this. The Netherworld stuff is absolutely inspired, and while the Prosperity Vault is a new addition to the lore, it feels completely natural as a piece of Thassilonian history. I wouldn't make any other major changes in Chapter 2. Chapter 3, the final chapter of the AP, is absolutely fantastic. I love it. It is a great way to end the AP. It feels epic, and that's the greatest compliment I can give it. Having Sortion's aid in the final encounter manifest as a hazard which affects Xandergul is a truly inspired choice, and I hope this becomes something which other writers use as a mechanic in the future. There are only two small changes I would make, and they are both very minor. The first is the interaction with the tormented heroes right before the Heart's Precipice. This feels a little weird, since time manipulation and alternative futures aren't really played with mechanically in the AP up to this point. I'm not sure if it will feel out of place at your table, but it felt a little odd on the page as I was reading it. The second change is to give Xandergul his Lucerne Hammer. This is his weapon of rule, one of the most iconic representations of his power, and it's a shame that he doesn't wield it in the final encounter as written. He has a hammer, but it's not special. Plus, this weapon is infused with a copy of his personality, so once he's defeated, the heroes can recover the artifact and keep it around to gain access to an echo of his consciousness. And that's it. Those are all the minor changes I would make to the narrative of this AP to improve upon it. As a reminder, for this section I was limiting myself to non-structural changes, things which didn't demand whole rewrites to existing content. The next section is similar, as I start to focus on the Risen Runelords and give each of them a distinct mechanical personality. These changes are small and self-contained, so this is sort of a continuation of Part 1. Part 2. Customizing the Risen Runelords. Let me begin this section by clarifying, I love what this AP is trying to do with the Risen Runelords. There are 42 Runelords in the history of Thassilon, and up until this AP, the vast majority of them had never been seen. This AP puts all the Runelords front and center, and in a way which feeds into the characterization of the main villain. Of course Xandergul would figure out a way to make all the Runelords subservient to him. That is the most Xandergul thing he could have possibly done. He always viewed himself as the rightful king of Thassilon, Xin's true successor, and in creating the Risen Runelords, he's finally found the means of making that vision a reality. That being said, even I, the biggest Thassilon nerd outside of Paizo's employees or contractors, got a little tired of seeing the same, or nearly the same, Risen Runelord stat block repeated multiple times throughout the adventure path. To be clear, I get it. The author has limited page space to describe these characters mechanically, so they all need to be largely the same. The solution of having the Sin spell schools be interchangeable was extremely elegant, and I applaud whoever came up with that idea. It's efficient and simple. But changing out the spell slots can only get a wizard's stat block so far in terms of identity. So, in this section, I'm proposing some simple edits to add some characterization to the individual Runelords. Most of these edits will be relatively small, adding only a single action, reaction, or similar trait. I'll be covering the Risen Runelords in the order in which they are encountered in the narrative. Starting off in Book 1, the first Risen Runelord the PCs encounter is Gimmel, the third Runelord of Greed. Gimmel is most well known for summoning the Oliphant of Jondelay during the Thassilon-Aslant War. When the Oliphant appears, it is heralded by the sound of blaring trumpets. I suggest granting Gimel a special 2-action ability to draw in a portion of John DeLay's power, granting him a battle form which takes on tusk-like natural attacks, and armor reminiscent of the Oliphant, which also unleashes a blast of blaring trumpets. This would effectively combine a 5th or 6th level Noise Blast spell, which has a cone effect rather than a burst, with the tusk and grabbing trunk aspects of a 5th level Elephant form spell. I envision this transformation allowing Gimel to retain his humanoid shape, but still increasing his AC and temporary hit points. Up next are Kroon, Krenlith, and Atherend, encountered on Dragonback during the Return of the Risen event in Chapter 2. Kroon is the 7th and final Runelord of Sloth, and we know plenty about him. He's most famous for his runic tattoos, which were supposedly manifestations of the knowledge bestowed upon him by Lasala. I could see using these in 3 different ways. One could be to homebrew a new version of the old Living Rune monster from 1E, and giving Kroon the ability to summon one of these creatures to aid him in battle. The next idea I have is to use these in the same way the runes of a rune giant are used, granting him the Flashing Runes ability with a DC appropriate to his level. Or, my third idea is to allow Kroon to activate these runic tattoos to create some kind of defensive aura, like a Protector's Sphere spell heightened to 5th level. Krenlith, unfortunately, is one of the Runelords about whom we know absolutely nothing. All we really know is that he was the 5th Runelord of Sloth, and reigned for 95 years. His artwork in this book, which is the first we've ever gotten of him, is quite nice, though all it does is tell us that he also had a small number of runic tattoos, alongside a pair of embedded Aeon Stones. I suggest simply granting him a special variant of the Blink Charge spell, which allows his dragon mount to teleport forward and make a single strike as a reaction. But that strike would be at a penalty, to make up for the fact that the dragon isn't familiar with the spell. This is powerful, but leaves Krenlith exposed and separates him from his dragon. If, for some reason, your party ends up needing to fight Atherend in this encounter, then we need to get creative once again. Atherend, who I accidentally called Afferend with an F sound in my original SinMas series, is another Runelord whom we know basically nothing about. He was the 2nd Runelord of Gluttony, and was killed by Xandergul himself in the schism of -6150 AR. Most of the Runelords of Gluttony lived a very long time, implying that they might have become undead. Only Zutha, the final Runelord of Gluttony, was ever confirmed to be undead, but I don't see it as unreasonable to turn Atherend into a ghoul or a vampire, undead beings with a connection to hunger. Let's go with ghoul here, to avoid any sunlight issues. This would grant him the Stench, Jaws, and Consume Flesh abilities. Finally, at the end of Book 1, we encounter Angothane and Thibidos. Both of these are former Runelords of Wrath, meaning this will be a blast-heavy boss fight involving battlefield control and lots of AoE effects. To begin with, I suggest introducing a mechanic connecting Xandergul's throne to the statues in the room. By sitting in the throne, one of the 2 Runelords can spend an action to cast their next spell from the location of any of the statues in the room. This is powerful, but does lock that Runelord down, which could be exploited. With Thibidos and Angothane specifically, we actually have a lot to work with. Thibidos, the 4th Runelord of Wrath, had a strong affinity for snakes, serpents, and hydras. I say we give him a unique 2-action effect, which functions like a 30-foot cone into which he can unleash some spiritual snakes, which deal a combination of piercing and poison damage, with a reflex DC appropriate to his level. Alternatively, and I kinda like this one even more, you could give him a unique spell shape effect, which lets him curve his lightning bolts into a serpentine shape. I especially like that I can envision this one as a giant snake made of lightning slithering across the battlefield, but I'm not entirely sure how balanced that would be. Angothane, the 2nd Runelord of Wrath, is a little trickier. He's most famous for having struck a deal with Nocticula, which eventually resulted in his death at the hands of Xandergul, but only after he succeeded in assassinating his rival, Runelord Zirie. For Angothane, I like the idea of giving him a unique ability related to lustfulness or seduction. Granting him an arcane variant on the focus spells of the Passion Cleric domain could be a good idea, but honestly they aren't very strong. Another option might be to give him access to a spell like Dominate or Sleep, which he can cast once per day by revealing a tattoo of Nocticula's demonic rune. Entering Book 2, the first risen Runelord we encounter is Haframa, the 7th Runelord of Greed. Haframa was the immediate predecessor to Karzug, and was an accomplished spell developer and alchemist. For this reason, I suggest allowing him to throw alchemist bombs, appropriate for his level, in addition to his spells. I also suggest giving him access to new homebrew versions of some of his most well-known spells: Artificer's Curse, Disillusion, Emblem of Greed, Fool's Gold, Legendary Proportions, Liquefy, Open Arms, or Rune of Ruin, among others. After Haframa, we face off against Califesta, the first Runelord of Gluttony. We know vanishingly little about Califesta, unfortunately, but her artwork implies that she was not undead, so we can't just slap a vampire or ghoul template on her and be done with it. Instead, I suggest stealing the Grave Knight Warmaster's Sacrilegious Aura ability, representing the work she would have done in counteracting vitality spells to protect her precious undead hordes. All you need to do is increase her counteract modifier to a value appropriate to her level, maybe 25 or 26. Then we come across Runelord Zirie, first Runelord of Sloth. Zirie was a devout servant of Kolifir, the demon lord of dragons, who was assassinated by Nocticula in the days of ancient Thassilon. I like the idea of giving her access to the Dragon Breath focus spell from the Draconic sorcerer bloodline, and allowing her to choose which damage type she wants to deal on the fly. As she does this, the demonic rune of Kolifir, which might be displayed somewhere on her person, should begin to glow or flash. Then we move on to Tanaris and Ivamura, who we fight in a shared encounter. Tanaris was the second Runelord of Envy, having succeeded Naft. He's most famous for having ordered the creation of the Sword of Envy, which he gifted to his son. The son, also named Tanaris, became the bodyguard of the father, until Tanaris the Elder became jealous of his son's powers, and the two murdered one another. This isn't a lot to work on, but I think we could have a lot of fun by having Tanaris followed around by a ghost of a swordsman, who looks like a younger version of Tanaris the Runelord. This doesn't need to be much beyond the ability to make a ghostly melee strike with an ethereal sword for a single action. I also like the idea of role-playing Tanaris as unsure which Tanaris he actually is, the father or the son. Ivamura, unfortunately, is less well understood. She succeeded Tanaris as the third Runelord of Envy, and is most famous for having died at the hands of the Aslanti near the outbreak of the Thassilon-Aslant War. You could play upon the idea of the Runelords of Envy being excellent bureaucrats and administrators by giving her a one-action metamagic ability called Administrative Spell, which adds a rider effect to a spell which overwhelms a target's mind with logistical details and dazzles or stupefies them when they fail a save against the initial spell. Then we come to Karzug. Ah, Karzug. It's been a long time, my friend. How you doing? Honestly, I like Karzug as he is. He feels consistent with his former self, and I don't think he needs much mechanical identity beyond being the strongest risen Runelord so far. Also, his new art is incredible. I love that Xandergul gave him such ridiculous drip. Then we get to the rapid-fire Doomsday Door sequence, and this is the part where I will detail the individual Runelords in these sequences, but also the forces they might command, and some of the additional hazards players might need to face in these challenges. Up first is the Doomsday Door beneath Yol, the capital city of the lands of the Lenorm Kings. The Runelord leading this charge is Fethrir, second Runelord of Greed. Fethrir is largely a mystery, but did aid in the creation of the Rune Giants. For that reason, she should absolutely have at least one Rune Giant among her forces, if not more than one. These giants could be backed up by greed-spawn soldiers, scaled up to a higher power level, and of course other giants that they've ensnared to their service. Fethrir herself could lean into this giant theme, with a unique version of the 8th rank spell Monstrosity Form, which grants her access to a giant form with a 40-foot speed and a lethal fist attack, which deals 2d12 plus 20 damage with Reach 10 and the Agile trait. She also maintains her Runelord's polearm in this form, which increases its reach by an additional 10 feet. The special ability of this giant form could be a one-action ability to create magical difficult terrain in a 10-foot aura around her body, as she activates her giant runes. Looking at the full set of encounters in Yol, the book makes it clear that blizzards and storms are present, so at least one hazard should involve intense cold, or perhaps even an ice elemental. The book also makes clear that there are plenty of traps in the dungeons beneath Yol, so take a look at high-level adventures like Pray for Death or Claws of the Tyrant Part 3 to steal traps which are appropriately thematic. If you're looking for more enemies to tack onto this encounter, you could add a Lenorm to the enemy forces, flavoring it as a Lenorm seeking to end the reign of the Ulfin, who make a tradition out of hunting its kin. Next is the Doomsday Door beneath Korvosa, hidden in an ancient chamber connected to the sewer system of the city. The book lists the leader here as Zarva, but that's dumb. We're going to shuffle things around a bit and replace her with Aethusa, the third Runelord of Gluttony. If that name confuses your players, tell them to talk to the Aethusa they've already freed from Xandergul's control. She'll explain it. We don't know anything about Aethusa III, so she's a blank slate. This works out well, because the doom facing Korvosa is related to Bloodveil, a magical disease developed by cultists of Urgathoa during the events of the Curse of the Crimson Throne adventure path. To tie this together, let's make Aethusa III a devotee of Urgathoa, and grant her access to arcane versions of the focus spells from the cleric's plague domain. When she dies, you can then transform her into a souped-up daughter of Urgathoa for a second stage boss fight. Thinking about her minions, she should be served by Gluttony Spawn, of course, but also by Skeleton Infantry with the Elite template, flavored as Undead Grey Maidens. Scarlet Walkers are closely associated with Bloodveil and Korvosa, so throw one or two of those in here. And then add a homebrew monster, which is essentially a super Otyugh, since the Otuyghs famously fill the sewers of Korvosa. As a hazard to throw in, I suggest calling back to the opening of Curse of the Crimson Throne by kicking off a new battle between the city's housedrake population and a bunch of wild imps escaped from the academy. Then we move on to Old Xin-Edassaril, the former capital of Edassaril before Bellamarius moved it to the current location of her seat of power. I suggest putting Zarve here, since he ruled from Old Xin-Edassaril for about 100 years, putting him on his home turf in this encounter. Zarve is one of the Runelords about whom we know absolutely nothing, so once again we have a blank slate. With nothing to go on, I suggest making Zarva a devotee of Lasala, who's been driven mad by her absence in the Age of Lost Omens. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how we express this mechanically. Looking at the forces which might back Zarva up, obviously we need to include some Envy Spawn soldiers, as well as some Lasalan cultists devoted to the Sihedron Scion, who've been recruited to Zarva's side. We should also tack on a bunch of ghosts of the various administrators and bureaucrats who once filled the government halls of the city. The disaster here is a flood, and Xin-Edassaril was once invaded by the Aslanti navy, so let's go ahead and add some water-based undead of Aslanti sailors and marines to make things interesting. Heck, as a backdrop, let's just have the ghostly administrators and the aquatic invaders fighting for the fate of the city. Alright, we're halfway through these, so let's keep going. Up next is Sech Navali, the Peacock Spirit Temple complex suspended over a valley via a set of enormous chains. Here, I'm changing the leader to Runelord Iltherius, the second of Sloth, since Sech Navali was in his backyard. Iltherius is backed up here by the many Grave Knights in the temple. These Grave Knights were once members of the Order of the Green Feather, the militant arm of the Peacock Spirit's faith. They were sworn to defend the temple, and have persisted in undeath since Earthfall. These Grave Knights should be backed up by some Envy Spawn soldiers. The book also makes clear that creatures of dreams and nightmares are emerging from this Doomsday Door, so let's add some denizens of Leng spiders, as well as night hags and animate dreams. Iltherius can be mechanically unique by being able to generate portals to transport his forces all around the temple, reminiscent of the portal network featured in the now-lost city of Xin-Haruka. Moving north, the next Doomsday Door is located at The Sleeper, the former site of Xin-Gastache. This is where we'll put Goparlus, the fourth of Gluttony, since this was his former seat of power. Goparlus is most famous for his obsession with Ungaroto, the Sword of Gluttony. We don't know a ton about him beyond that, so let's just go ahead and make him a vampire right off the bat for some added identity and flavor. Given his level, he would be a true vampire, with the change shape, drink blood, dominate, and turn to mist abilities, in addition to a bite attack. After that, let's play around with the idea that Xandergul wants to mentally torture Goparlus. Goparlus should be accompanied by the Grave Knight Ungaroto, for whom the Sword of Gluttony was eventually named, and Ungaroto's undead dragon companions. These characters all hated one another, so I like the idea of them being forced to work together. The doom here comes in the form of undead hordes pouring out of the sleeper, so let's go ahead and use the troop rules with troops of undead and gluttony spawn. In this encounter, the heroes should be backed up by the dragon Svanostel, who previously fought back against the return of Zutha. Mechanically, Svanostel will need to be updated and turned into an Oath Dragon. Finally, we come back to Wind Song Abbey, the site of the first Doomsday Door opening back in Shattered Star. This is where I would put Essedrea, the Sixth of Envy, not because she's especially close to this site, but because she's the one I have left after moving around the other 5. Essedrea is another blank slate. The book makes it clear that the doom here is related to Qlipoth, calling back to the warrior Ardathanatus and his attempt to reach out to the Qlipoth lord Yamasoth. So let's go ahead and add some Augnagor, Mugrazant, and maybe even a Thulgant Qlipoth to the encounter lineup. After that, let's add some undead or haunts related to Ardathanatus himself, or the Groton cultists he worked with. Lastly, add in some envy spawn to round things out. To make Essedrea feel unique, let's go ahead and tie her to the Qlipoth by making her a worshipper of the Qlipoth lord Nyo-Og, the Always Observing, whose focus on the destruction of other spellcasters seems very appropriate for a Runelord of Envy. Mechanically, this could manifest as a simple reaction, like Reactive Strike, which in her case would allow her to manifest a tentacle and strike enemies who cast magic within her reach. In Book 3, we only face 3 Risen Runelords, and all 3 are confronted in the same encounter. The most powerful of these 3 is Alasnist, the 5th and final Runelord of Wrath. Alasnist was known for many things, but from the perspective of Xandergul, she is most notable for having killed him with the Scepter of Ages. I imagine that Xandergul would take a special pleasure in cursing this particular Risen Runelord with a tormented existence. I like the idea of having this variant of Alasnist being constantly torn apart and reassembled by Qlipoth tentacles. This would give her a flat 20% check to ignore precision damage and critical hits, represented by a DC 5 flat check. Additionally, all squares within 5 feet of her would be treated as magical difficult terrain, and anyone within that space would need to succeed at a reflex save, or become grabbed. Alongside Alasnist, the players will face Aethusa, the 6th Runelord of Greed. Aethusa is a complete blank slate, so I say we drop her entirely and replace her with Runelord Lignia, the 4th Runelord of Greed. Lignia was the Runelord who oversaw the forging of the Sword of Greed, Chelin. I suggest giving her the sword, and making her a specialist in polymorph spells. This should give her a battle form like Ferris form, but with an improved natural attack and some extra HP and AC. To represent the power of the Sword of Greed, her attack should have a rider effect, where a critical hit should force a fortitude save to avoid becoming slowed, or petrified on a critical failure. Again, I love the Swords of Sin, so I want to add as many of them as I can to this campaign. Lastly, Alasnist is also supported by Jura, the 4th Runelord of Envy. Jura was personally killed by Xandergul during the schism of -6150 AR. Beyond this, we know very little about him. As a Runelord of Envy, he would have been the expert in counterspelling. So, I say we just give him the Sin counterspell ability from the Runelord archetype in rival academies and call it a day. And that's it. That's every Risen Runelord in this AP. I like them in theory, but hopefully these changes will help them to land a little bit better in practice. Part 3. Major Structural Changes. Okay, so this section is where I get to embrace my own particular kind of insanity and turn Revenge of the Runelords into the campaign that I really want it to be. This may very well be our last AP focused on the Runelords of Thassilon, so I say we go all out. Before I really dig in, I want to start with a few conspiracy-adjacent suspicions I have rattling around in my brain. I strongly suspect that this AP was outlined back before Paizo committed to the 3-book AP structure for business reasons. I have a few reasons for this belief. First of all, the previous APs in the Runelords series are 6 books, so it would make narrative sense to continue in that vein. Second, the sheer number of things the PCs do in this campaign is enormous. In Book 1, we have the discovery of the Trinity Star cultists, the kidnapping of Sorshan, the collapse of and exodus from Zin-Edasseril, and the exploration of Xin-Eurythnia. In Book 2, we have a dragon-riding road trip across Varissia, the dungeon on the Isle of Xin, the meeting with the three generals, the Crypt of Runes dungeon, the entire frickin' Doomsday Door sequence, which takes place across all of Varissia, a trip to the Dimension of Dreams, and a small dungeon in Leng. In Book 3, we retake Xin-Eurythnia from Belimarius, discover the means of summoning the Oliphant, ride the Oliphant to Jondelay, fight the Ashen Man, and finally face Xandergul. All of that is crammed into 3 books, which is absolutely ridiculous. It sure seems like this is way too much for 3 volumes. Lastly, I have a sneaking suspicion that there was actually a subplot, which was planned for this AP, which was cut from the final product. Like I mentioned in my Rise of New Thassilon video, the Cult of Lissala got a lot of attention in War of Immortals, and that article name-dropped a dungeon called the Temple of the Seven Wings. At the same time, we got new information on Runelord Gimel, who now exists as a shamisen demon, who specifically wants to destroy the Oliphant of Jondelay by accessing it via the Spindlehorn. War of Immortals also hinted that Gimel only ever accessed Jondelay via blessings from Lissala. All of this tells me that there may have been a subplot tying together Lissala, Gimel, and Jondelay, which was a running subplot throughout the AP, but which was ultimately cut for page count reasons. Do I definitely believe this is the case? No, absolutely not. I am not a narcissist. I am not that irrational. I am probably making up connections that don't actually exist. But it's fun to think about, and there's certainly the possibility that I'm kinda sorta on the right track. So, what do I intend to introduce in this section? Well, at the most basic level, I'll be adding sequences which allow the narrative to breathe, cutting back on the relentless breakneck pace a bit, and reintroducing some narrative depth, which I think was missed in the original AP. The Church of Lissala, for instance, is completely missing in this AP, which is a huge missed opportunity in the narrative. Similarly, Xin-Eurythnia is completely unexplored in the AP before the Exodus begins, making it very hard for the characters to feel a connection to the citizens before they need to lead them to safety. I want to add elements to fill these gaps, hopefully enriching the narrative depth and increasing player connection with the story. All of these changes will, unfortunately, have the cumulative effect of drastically increasing the runtime of the campaign. At the same time, I don't want to start the AP any lower than level 12, since I want to maintain the epic feel. My solution is to abandon the XP-based leveling entirely and go over to story-based leveling, where the GM simply tells the players when their characters level up. This might not work for some gaming groups, since a lot of players might not like a slower rate of mechanical growth, so this is something to talk about with your group. Alright, so let's get to my major changes. I'll mostly be addressing these in the order in which they would be encountered. Right away in Book 1, we need to introduce a Chapter 0 to this campaign. The AP as written starts off with an absolute banger of an encounter in the form of the chase scene with the Ashen Man. As awesome as this is, however, it has the unfortunate consequence of setting the PCs up for their fight with Gimel immediately before the attack on Sorshan's ceremony, leaving them almost no time to interact with Xin-Eurythnia and the people of Sorshan's kingdom. So, I would start by adding a Chapter 0, which takes place before the Ashen Man sequence. The idea for this chapter is relatively simple. Put the PCs in the role of level 12 adventurers summoned by Sorshan to witness the portal ceremony, whom she is also interested in potentially recruiting as her agents. These heroes have been summoned to the Church of Nocticula in the city, which is housed in the former House of Divine Consumption, a temple once devoted to the sin of greed itself. Ayava serves as the quest giver for this Chapter 0, and the heroes will need to meet her in the temple to receive their assignments. Arriving at the temple, the PCs will meet Ayava at a desk beneath an immense mosaic depicting Runelord Gimel standing in a magic circle atop the Spindlehorn as he confronts the Oliphant of Jondelay. Ayava will comment on the mosaic, explaining Gimel's story to the PCs, and explaining that she can't bring herself to tear down such a magnificent piece of art, even if Gimel and the other Runelords of Greed were monsters. This is important, because Gimel will play a much larger role in this version of the story. Every time the heroes get a mission, they come back to Ayava at this location, seeing the mosaic each time. Ayava will then explain the 3 missions she has for the PCs. Each of these missions is relatively short, but ties into the 3 factions in the city: the Runelord students, the merchants, and the giants. The goal here is simple: introduce the factions and ingratiate the PCs to them, so when the Exodus happens, the PCs are in a better position to take command. For the merchants, Ayava sends the heroes to a clockwork researcher under the command of faction leader Sonrasi, who's been studying new developments in Thassilonian clockwork. This should be the same researcher from the Constructs Amok sequence at the portal ceremony, who is now a friend, cohort, or apprentice to Toth Breacher, the wizard with the clockwork whale in Book 2. This sequence should involve missing clockwork experiments, which have wandered off to the Hypogeum, the massive underground network of abandoned buildings beneath the city. The researcher believes they've simply wandered off due to faulty programming caused by his meddling with their clockwork brains, but at least some of them have been reworked by the cult of the Trinity Star. Entering the Hypogeum, the heroes rescue the clockwork from the various threats in the depths, maybe a combination of Darklands denizens, undead, and other twisted things still bound to the city. But they also face off against at least one rogue clockwork, which has been reprogrammed to be evil. The heroes pick up a hint at the cult's involvement, but not nearly enough to discover their nature. They report this hint to Ayava. The mission for the Giants takes the PCs out of the city proper, onto the Golden Road along the River Ava. The Giant labor force has been tasked by Sorshan with building a new version of the road, which doesn't pass through Leng, providing an actual physical pathway out of the mountains. They are aided in this by priests of Nocticula and scholars of rune magic, who work to detangle the eldritch energies of Leng and give the Giants room to work. This mission then becomes a defensive combat, with the heroes facing off against waves of Leng-based threats, as the Giants and spellcasters make the final push toward the Fen of the Ice Mists to complete the physical road. Also, I'm changing the leader of the Giant labor force to a rune giant. It's still Voshkar, and they refuse to use their powers of compulsion on other giants. The rune giants are important to Thassilonian history, and this AP needs to feature more of them. Voshkar should be able to explain what happened to the rune giants, and how most of them have either abandoned the Runelords entirely for a free life in the Kodor Mountains, or have been ensnared into Belimarius' service. This foreshadows the rune giant encounters in Book 3. Back within Xin-Eurythnia proper, the heroes get their final mission, which is tied to the Runelord students. The faction leader Jathariel 5 Runes needs the heroes to enter the Hypogeum again to investigate the disappearance of several students from his school. This is a fairly straightforward mini-dungeon, with the heroes once again encountering a corrupted clockwork, working for the cult of the Trinity Star, but also encountering a greed-spawn soldier in the robes of the cult. In truth, the missing students have been taken by the cult of the Trinity Star. Some have been recruited, while those who proved unwilling were killed outright. Notably, many of those recruited belong to the School of Pride. The PCs can discover the corpses of the killed students, but only discover a few further clues to the cult's existence. All of this is reported back to Ayava. During these missions, each of the heroes should individually catch a glimpse of the Ashen Man, though they won't know anything about him up to this point, except that he's an ominous hooded figure with blood-red arms. Also, during these missions, the heroes should witness Ayava working with a woman in a red hood and veil, who nondescriptly does her duties and is even present during the Giant mission, helping administer the roadwork. This is one of Sorshan's blood simulacra, though the players shouldn't find that out yet. This chapter also gives the players an opportunity to undertake the various downtime activities outlined in the official player's guide from Paizo. These activities don't have a ton of time to breathe in the AP as written, so adding them to Chapter 0 gives the players a chance to interact with Xin-Eurythnia as a setting, beyond just completing the missions themselves. After the third mission is complete, then we jump to the Ashen Man dream sequence, which is otherwise the same. For the Dawn Silver Forge mission, the heroes should meet Ayava at her desk at the temple again, and this time she is attended by that same woman in the red veil and hood. Ayava explains that she's tracked the clues of the cultists, which the PCs found, back to the Dawn Silver Forge. Then, this mission plays out largely as written, including my customization of Runelord Gimmel, and throwing in a couple clockwork enemies as well. At this point in the narrative, the heroes should be able to immediately recognize Gimmel themselves, and realize that something truly insidious is going on. When the risen Gimmel dies, however, his body doesn't fade or vanish. Instead, a portal to the outer rifts opens up, and the body is infused with demonic energy, at which point it is pulled away through the portal. This will be important later on. At this point, the heroes report to Sorshan, and this social encounter is a test by the former Runelord of Lust, as I explained earlier. At the end of the encounter, the woman in the red veil walks in, revealing herself as one of Sorshan's many blood simulacra, and she confirms what the heroes have said, or adds in any details that they missed. Then we come to the portal ceremony, and you might need to come up with a new update to the Constructs Amok challenge, since your players have already helped the researcher once, and we don't want things to get stale. During the attack by Xandergul, the heroes should briefly witness Runelord Gimmel watching in the crowd, still infused with the energy of the Outer Rifts, a look of hatred on his face as he stares up at the Oliphant. He disappears before the heroes can get to him. After that, we add some missions given by Ayava to try and get life in Xin-Eurythnia back under control. This should, like I mentioned in the small changes section, tie back to the factions, with the caveat that, in this version, the faction leaders are already familiar with the heroes due to the Chapter 0 missions. When we get to the Exodus itself, refer back to the advice I gave in the small changes section of the video. This version, however, should put the PCs back into direct contact with Jethariel 5 Runes, the elf leader of the new Runelords faction, the students within the city. During this encounter, the heroes should witness him offering prayers to Lasala, and have the opportunity to make a lore check to discover that he is a follower of the Order of Virtue, her heretical good aspect. When the dragon attack happens at the end of the Exodus, Jethariel and the rune giant Voshgar are deeply affected, and both encourage the heroes to head out with the omen dragon Kandirvek to investigate. Jethariel will come back up later, but we're stepping away from him for now. From here, I would mostly just implement the small changes I already suggested for the rest of Book 1. The same can be said for the beginning of Book 2, up until the Tarnished Temple. Once the heroes clear the Tarnished Temple, they are confronted by Runelord Gimmel once again, retooled with the more powerful Risen Runelord stat block, and backed up by a group of demons. Gimmel uses this encounter to inquire about the heroes' goals and figure out what they're doing, and when he's defeated, he's pulled back into the Outer Rifts once again. After this, the heroes should receive a panicked message from Liralaru. She passes along a hectic vision of Gimmel standing atop the Spindlehorn and summoning the Oliphant of Jondale, then says a short phrase like, "The pathways are converging in an unexpected way. This one, he is dangerous. I did not see him before, but now I cannot get him out of my sight." The vision then fades quickly, as Liralaru flees from the agents of the Ashen Man. Then I implement all the small changes I already mentioned for the 3 generals encounter, allowing the PCs to witness Belimarius in the sky, and replacing Lograssi with Captain Joshel. Inside of the Crypt of Runes, I would alter the Crypt of Greed. In addition to this crypt having been raided by Xandergul's cultists, it has now been ransacked by the Risen Gimmel, and his spirit has been removed from the social encounter. Also, several demons now infest the site, and must be defeated before the social encounter with the Runelords of Greed can begin. During the social encounter, the Runelords of Greed will participate in the conversation as written, but will also speculate about Gimmel's motives, and why he is active, and what he might be doing. The rest of the Crypt of Runes should simply implement the minor changes I suggested earlier. Once the PCs recover a Thusa at the end of the crypt, they should be able to question her about Gimmel. Based on her experience, the PCs should be able to understand that whatever Gimmel's up to, he's not aligned with Xandergul. After this, we come to the Doomsday Door sequence, and again, I strongly suggest turning this into a series of small dungeons, handled by the PCs of previous adventures. See my minor suggestions and the custom Risen Runelords section from earlier in the video for my advice on how to implement that. After the Doomsday Door sequence, the heroes return to the Thoracic Library, where they are joined by Jethariel 5 Runes, the leader of the rune magic students from Book 1. Jethariel is here to assist, but the heroes might detect that he is keeping something to himself. Pressing him on this, the heroes can discover that he has received a call from some mysterious force, possibly Lasala herself, or possibly Liralaru. This call has brought him to the Thoracic Library to help. From here, the heroes enter the Dimension of Dreams, to destroy Dream Aethusa, accessing it via the Dreaming Tower fragment at the Guilt Spur, possibly on the suggestion of a PC from one of the previous Runelord APs. The Dreamland sequence is similar, but begins with a message from Liralaru. She magically projects before the heroes and issues a panicked message. "I was wrong. The dooms we face are so much greater than I ever imagined. Pride will bring about the end of Galarian, but greed seeks to bring about the end of ends, the end of beginnings. Find the 7 wings. You must save Jondelay. You must stop." She's then cut off by the agents of the Ashen Man, who capture her with astral chains and drag her through a portal to Leng. The Ashen Man then sends nightmare creatures from Leng through the portal to harry the PCs and stop them from following Liralaru. After dealing with these monsters, the PCs then play out the Dream Cyrusian encounter as written, killing Dream Aethusa. They then return to the material plane. Their greatest lead should now be the 7th wing, which Liralaru mentioned. The heroes should begin researching this, but their efforts should stop when Jathariel 5 Runes hears the phrase. He then reveals the truth of his religious faith. He belongs to a rogue sect of Lissalans, devoted to the Order of Virtue. His fellow worshippers have recently and secretly discovered the Temple of the 7 Wings, an ancient temple to Lissala, which may hold the key to restoring her more benevolent personality traits. Additionally, the Temple of the 7 Wings is supposedly where Runelord Gimel spent much of his time as a devout Lissalan. As such, it might hold a clue to the risen Gimel's motivations. The heroes can then travel to the Temple of the 7 Wings. This is an entirely new dungeon I would want to develop for this AP. Arriving at the dungeon, the PCs immediately confront a group of evil Lissalans assaulting the location. These are followers of the evil Sihedron Scion aspect. Once the heroes defeat these Vindicators, they access the temple interior and are welcomed by the followers of the Order of Virtue. These cultists calmly explain that they don't have the power to explore beyond the first level of the temple, due to the powerful monsters inside. Then the heroes enter the dungeon, and face multiple powerful enemies. High-level sin spawn of all 7 sins, ghost wizards devoted to the Sihedron Scion, undead rune giants, and maybe even a few inverted giants. As described in War of Immortals, the final boss at the heart of this dungeon is a multi-headed serpent, branded with a Sihedron rune, a mighty servant of Lissala which has been trapped in stasis. This being is a living vault, and contains within itself a golden book. This book contains the knowledge granted to Gimel by Lissala about Jondelay. Also, somewhere in this dungeon, the heroes should find a Mother of Oblivion, a Black Maga converted to the 2E rule set. We've fought Black Magas in each of the previous 3 Runelords APs, so we should definitely fight one here. Returning to the temple entrance, the heroes meet with Ezalin, the leader of the Lissalan cultists. She explains that Lissala was punished by the other gods for having granted knowledge of Jondelay to mortals. She believes that by undoing this evil and removing the knowledge of Jondelay from the world, Lissala can be reminded of the power of good and potentially restored to her virtuous self. She advises, however, not to destroy the Golden Book until Gimel have been stopped. If the heroes attempt to read the book, called the Gilded Codex, they can learn that Jondelay is a seed for the next iteration of reality, to be used by the survivor to restart the universe after Rovagug destroys everything. They can learn much of the ritual needed to summon the Oliphant, but not all of it. A few pages are missing. Mechanically, the Gilded Codex can be used to provide an item bonus on all checks to navigate Jondelay later in this adventure. Now, we get back to the main plot, as Liralaru manages to send one final message to the heroes. This call for help is only possible because of Lissala's direct influence, and it triggers when the cult leader, Ezalin, offers a single prayer. She becomes infused with Lissala's power, and passes along Liralaru's call for help from Leng. At this point, the heroes can return to the Dimension of Dreams, or go directly to Leng via the portal in Giltspur. They can then travel to Liralaru's oubliette to free her from her imprisonment, which remains basically unchanged from the dungeon presented in the book. Once Liralaru is free, she can explain what's going on. The risen Gimel has been possessed by Gimel himself, who, upon death, has become a Shamazen demon. Gimel is now acting through his risen incarnation to further his goal of killing the Oliphant of Jondelay. Review my Rise of New Thassilon video to further explore his motivations, or just read his entry in War of Immortals. Liralaru now explains that the heroes must discover the final sequence of the Oliphant summoning ritual, which was likely hidden somewhere within Xin-Shalast. If these documents were ever recovered, they are likely hidden in Sorshin's private archives in the Blood Moon Palace. We now kick off Book 3, with all the minor updates I mentioned in my previous sections. We do rearrange some things in the Blood Moon Palace, however, and I need to credit my colleague Nictorak for this idea. We're going to move the location of the anima focus for Sorshin's rune well to the interior of her archives, and specifically the pool in the low center area of the map. The social encounter with Belimarius's generals is now in front of the entrance to the archives, a map we would need to create. After passing the generals, the heroes then enter the archives, where they face various guards left behind by Belimarius, including Sinspawn, runic students in the form of wizards and maguses, and some of Sorshin's own traps and hazards. This turns the relatively empty archives into a proper dungeon crawl, as befits such a cool map. Once the heroes enter the Rune Well of Lust, they face Belimarius as before. They then have access to the cleared-out archives, allowing them to begin the research challenge. This research in Sorshin's archives is now aided by the Gilded Codex, as the PCs struggle to fill in the information on the missing pages. The next major change occurs when the PCs return to the top of the Spindlehorn from the Prosperity Vault. Here they are confronted by the Risen Gimel for a final time. He now uses the same elite Risen Runelord template as a Lasnist, with his spells adjusted for a greed specialist. He's backed up by several demons and powerful cultists of Rovagug. After this fight, the heroes can summon the Oliphant, as presented in the book. As they ride the Oliphant, however, they have one final hurdle to face. Gimel himself, the Shamazin demon, appears via portal and attempts to kill the Oliphant. This becomes a complex combat encounter, with Gimel and his demonic followers devoted to Rovagug. During the combat, the PCs must also succeed in counteracting Gimel's Oliphant-murdering ritual. To succeed at interrupting the ritual, the heroes will need to perform a series of skill checks during the fight, but doing so well enough will give them a chance to redirect the ritual's magic to help damage Gimel himself and his allies. Once the demon Gimel is finally defeated, he lingers on the battlefield for a moment, raging madly that all must end. Suddenly, a shining humanoid being with 7 wings appears. It has no mouth or nose upon its face, and its snake-like eyes glow with an eerie green light. It reaches out to Gimel, who looks upon it with recognition and horror. The being erases Gimel with a touch, then turns to the heroes and utters a simple phrase: "Thank you." From here, the heroes arrive in Jondale, and the remainder of the AP can be completed with the minor changes I described earlier in the video. The one thing I would add is that the heroes should automatically receive the Divine Aid benefit in the fight against Xandergul, due to their service to Lasala in restoring her Order of Virtue aspect. And that is, finally, it. That is how I would rework Revenge of the Runelords into the AP I want it to be, rather than the AP which it is. And again, I really like the AP it is. I think it's pretty solid, and needs only a little work here and there to really shine. That might sound silly to say, since I've written 19 pages of notes on how to improve it, but you should take my suggested changes in context. I'm kind of a maniac when it comes to Thassilon lore. I have a very particular appreciation for the story of the Runelords, and my desires for this AP likely do not reflect the needs or desires of the standard GM or player. If I step back and try to put myself in the shoes of a not crazy person, the AP's biggest flaw is an over-reliance on callbacks and nostalgia, coupled with inconsistent quality of implementation when it comes to subsystems. Largely, it would be a pretty good AP for most groups without these changes. But again, I'm not exactly a normal person, so I figured I might as well indulge my obsession and outline the version of the AP which I would want to exist, in a world unconstrained by page count, budget, or publication date deadlines. Wow, that was a lot. I think I may have gone overboard on this one. Well, if you do want to play Revenge of the Runelords, that should be way more than enough to get you started. This AP is the end of an era for Paizo. It closes out both the Runelords story and the monthly Adventure Path release schedule, both of which started back in 2007. This AP is, more than any other AP in Paizo's history, a celebration of Paizo's past. It is best experienced as the final entry in a series of APs and adventures experienced by a gaming group. If this is your first foray into the lore of the Runelords, you're going to have your work cut out for you to get caught up on the storyline. I definitely suggest watching at least my What Happened In videos from earlier this month, but you might also want to commit to all my previous SinMas content from 2024. Speaking of which, this video wraps up SinMas 2025, and what a SinMas celebration it was. This series pushed my channel over a major milestone, 5,000 subscribers. I had a personal goal for myself to hit that number by the end of the year, and honestly, I cannot thank you all enough for helping me to achieve that. I really appreciate those of you who watch and share my videos, and especially those of you who engage with me in the comments. Also, on a more personal note, thank you to everyone who shared their well wishes and prayers for my dad's recovery these past few months. For those unaware, my dad took a nasty fall off a ladder in mid-December and suffered severe head and neck trauma, in addition to several lesser injuries. That he survived is something of a miracle. That's why this video ended up coming out later than I intended, since my wife, child, and I moved in with my parents to help while he recovered. But I'm happy to report that he is on the mend. It will be a long road to full recovery, but he's well on the way. Thank you again to those of you who reached out with kind words and support. I enjoy sharing my love of Pathfinder lore with everyone, but your participation with my content and the support we give each other as a community is what makes all the work that goes into this channel really worth it. SinMas 2025 feels like I finally finished the quest I began last year. I have, at long last, finished the grand epic of the Runelords and brought their story to a close. I hope these videos have been both entertaining and informative. The weekly schedule this year was much more sustainable, and I'm hoping to implement it for whatever next year's holiday special turns out to be. On that topic, SinMas will definitely be taking a break next year, since I've basically run out of Thassilon lore to talk about. I already have a plan for next year's holiday special series, but I want to leave it as a bit of a surprise. Like I mentioned last year, the holiday season is a very special time for me and my family, and I really enjoy being able to share some of that joy with you all by releasing a bunch of themed videos at the end of the calendar year. So once again, thank you all very much for watching, and I wish you all, well, it's a little late to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year's, but Happy January. I will see you all in February. And to all my fellow Minnesotans out there, hang in there. It's been a cold, scary January out there this year, but if there's one thing we up here know how to handle, it's ice.